January 17th, Martin Luther King Day in the United States. We want to begin today with remarks on the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, which were done by an economist and statesman, candidate formerly, and political leader Lyndon LaRouche, who passed away in 2019. These are remarks that he gave at a prayer breakfast sponsored by the Talladega County, Alabama Democratic Conference. And so we're going to now show you an excerpt of his remarks and reflections.
We have two problems, I think, which should be the basis for reflecting on Martin's life today. One, we have a national crisis. Now, I'm not going to mince words, and I'm not going to do any political hacking, but the facts have to be told. This economy is collapsing. The situation, relatively speaking, in terms of basic economic infrastructure of the United States today is worse than in 1933 when Roosevelt came into the White House in March. That is, you look around you, infrastructure, energy, so forth, the conditions of life of our people around the world. And don't look in the big cities where they put on a facade and say things are fine. Look in the communities. For example, Detroit now has half the population it used to have. An industrial city is gone. Look around Birmingham. You see how the same thing is reported. It was never rich, but their sense of loss of this, that. That's the situation of the United States. Then you got an indifference to the problems of the United States. We have 48 at least of the 50 states are bankrupt, hopelessly bankrupt. That is, the states cannot possibly raise the tax revenue without sinking the economy further to meet the essential obligations of government. This is characteristic of at least 48 states. And it's getting worse. If you look at the cost of living, the increase of the cost of living, as compared to what is officially reported, look at the prices of food in grocery stores over the past 6 months in the United States. We are in trouble. And look at the world. The world faces a great crisis, and the United States faces a great crisis in dealing with the world. The largest concentrations of population of the world are China, for example, 1.3 billion or more. India, over 1 billion. Then you have Pakistan, Bangladesh, and the countries of Southeast Asia. This is the greatest concentration of population on this planet. It's an emerging part of the world. The question is, what's the relationship of the United States to these people of Asia who represent, by and large, different cultural backgrounds than those of us in the United States or in Western Europe? How are we going to find peace in a troubled world? How are we going to find reconciliation in a troubled world with countries which have turned against us because of the war policies of Cheney and some others? So we do not face a new problem today, in one sense. We face the same problem in principle that Martin faced, and faced successfully. And I would propose that in the lesson of Martin Luther King and his life, there is something we can learn today which brings him back to life as if he was standing here alive today. There's something special about his life, his development, which should be captured today by us, not only in addressing the problems of our nation, which are becoming terrible, but the problems of our relationship with the world as a whole. How are we going to deal with these cultures that are different than our own? With an Asian culture, with Muslim cultures around the world, over 1 billion Muslims around the world, with the culture of China, which is different than ours, the culture of Southeast Asia, which is different than ours, the cultural background. They're all human, they all have the same ultimate requirements, the same needs, but they're different cultures. They think differently. They respond to different predicates than we respond to. But we must have peaceful cooperation with these people to solve a world problem. Then you start thinking about someone like Martin. And I want to indicate in the context I just stated what the significance of Martin is today. We had no replacement for Martin. Lesson number one. Martin was a unique personality. He was not a talented person who happened to stumble into leadership and could be easily replaced by other leaders who would learn the job and take over afterward. We had no replacement. No one in the position to replace him. Many wished to be, they didn't have it. What did Martin have? What was the essence of Martin that made him something special? Let's compare three cases to get at this. One, Martin himself. The other, the case of France's famous heroine, Jeanne d'Arc. And I'm rather familiar with the details of the actual history of the Jeanne d'Arc case, which is comparable in a sense, a very special way, to the case of Martin. And then also with a fictitious case, which points to the problem we face, the case of Shakespeare's Hamlet, especially the Hamlet of the third act soliloquy. Now, what was the issue? Martin was truly a man of God. Truly. In a way that very few people are actually able to realize in their lifetime. It wasn't just that he was a man of God, it's that he rose to the full appreciation of what that meant. Obviously, the image for him was Christ and the passion and crucifixion of Jesus Christ. That was his source of strength. He lived that. He had gone to the mountaintop at a point that he knew his life was threatened by powerful forces in the United States. And he said, I will not shrink from this mission, even if they kill me. Just as Christ said, and I'm sure that was in Martin's mind at that point. The passion and crucifixion of Christ is the image which is the essence of Christianity. It's an image, for example, in Germany or elsewhere where the Bach St. Matthew Passion is performed. It's a 2-hour performance approximately. And those 2 hours, the audience, the congregation, the singers, the musicians, relive in a powerful way the passion and crucifixion of Christ. And this has always been important, to relive that, to capture the essence of what Christ means for all Christians. And Martin showed that. The difference is this, and I'll come back to Jeanne d'Arc, called Joan of Arc in English. The difference is most people tend to believe, yes, I wish to go to heaven, or something like that. Or don't care. But they are looking for answers within the bounds of their mortal life. They're thinking of the satisfactions of the flesh, the security they will enjoy between the bounds of birth and death. Whereas the great leader, like Martin, rises to a higher level. They think of their life as the gospel presents it, as a talent. Life is a talent given to you. You're born and you die. That is your talent, what you have in that period. The question is, you're going to spend it anyway. How are you going to spend it? What are you going to spend it to secure for all eternity? What are you going to do as a mission that will earn you the place you want to occupy in eternity? Martin had a clear sense of that. That mountaintop address for me, that struck me years ago, it was just a clear understanding of exactly what he was saying to others. Life is a talent. It is not what you get out of life, it's what you put into it that counts.
Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. If you've just joined us, we welcome you to today's Schiller Institute International Forum. The conditions that were just described by Lyndon LaRouche back then, 2004, both in the United States and the world, are still true. And the need for leadership is as great as it was then, maybe greater. But the reason that these problems persist is that we have failed to give up or to assault what is sometimes called benign neglect, but we prefer the term depraved indifference. We have to come to realize that the greatest disease threatening humanity is that. And if you want to see the most spectacular case of that kind of depraved indifference, it is the situation confronting the nation of Afghanistan, which is being deliberately starved at the moment in the name of human rights. We can't allow for these kinds of conditions to continue, but we also have to have conceptions, sometimes conceptions of grand strategy, as to how to actually resolve these matters. To discuss that and to discuss why this conference and media, this seminar has been called, it's always my honor to introduce the founder and head of the Schiller Institute, Helga Zepp-LaRouche. Helga?
Yes, hello. Well, the situation in Afghanistan is indeed beyond imagination. For several months, I would say, for 1 month after the Taliban took over in August, there was a big media hype, mostly about the incredible circumstances of the US withdrawal, NATO withdrawal, Taliban taking over. But then for about 4 months after that, Afghanistan disappeared practically from the international media. And now it's all of a sudden back. And all the media are reporting figures and facts which are absolutely horrendous. According to the UN World Food Programme and other UN authorities, there are 24.4 million people in danger of not outliving this winter. There are about 8.7 million people who are starving as we are talking here right now. There are 50% of all children under 5 years in immediate danger of death. 16 million children between the age of being born and 16 are practically, food insecure, and most of them have to work because the families are starving. Now that means that these children are not being educated and they have to work, just to maintain the family. Naturally, there is an outbreak of measles, diarrhea, polio, COVID-19, malaria, and the malnutrition of these children, of which these children suffer, makes them naturally much more vulnerable to these kinds of infections. The catastrophe is so big, and this is not a media report. This comes from many, many eyewitnesses who, tell it back to their relatives. People are so poor and so desperate that after many days of not having any food, they're selling their children. For how much? They go $950 to $1,300 for a child. People sell their kidneys. Kidneys are a little bit more expensive. They are selling for $1,300 to $1,800. Now, this is not, unknown to the West. The West right now is more concerned about saving those Afghanis who collaborated with the NATO troops while they were still there. So they are making big efforts, like the German government says, we have to get out these people, saving them from the Taliban. I mean, they are trying to pull out the last most important professionals and educated people which are urgently needed there. So then you have on top of it the collapse of the currency since August by more than a fourth, which means people, even if they have a tiny amount of money, they cannot afford it because the prices are just galloping out of control. And naturally, the West has not only imposed sanctions, taken away the assets of the Afghan government, 8.5 billion in the United States, and I don't know how many 100 millions in European banks. So that money has been frozen. But they also have decoupled Afghanistan from the SWIFT agreement. So even Afghani people in exile cannot send money because the banking system has collapsed. Now this is deliberate. It's not an oversight, because now it is very interesting that there was an article in Foreign Affairs, that's the publication of the Council of Foreign Relations, on the 29th of December, where they, basically, there is now a whole series of articles in the New York Times, in the Financial Times, who all of a sudden say, oh, maybe it was a mistake, maybe we have to change policy. What this Foreign Affairs article says is that during the years of talks in fancy hotels in Qatar between US officials and the Taliban, these US officials would have warned the Taliban all the time and say, look, if you ever would try to take over control in Afghanistan and Kabul with military means, you will have a terrible situation. We will cut you off money. We will collapse your economy. You will be in economic isolation. You will be penniless. So then the article says, this, as we can now see, was not an empty threat. When the West stopped the aid, which accounted for 80% of the budget of the Afghan government in these 20 years of NATO presence, because they did not build up the economy, they just maintained the Afghan economy by having international aid. 80% of the budget was like that. So they all knew when the donor countries cut off that aid because they didn't like the Taliban takeover, they immediately collapsed the Afghan economy. And, they were freezing the assets. So even the money which belongs to the Afghan people was not accessible. And, immediately they threw half of the Afghan population into starvation. Now they say, oh, this was a mistake. This is antithetical to Western aims. We should help to revive the US should have to revive the Afghan economy. This is not good for US prestige. We have to work with the Taliban. This is the hallmark of realpolitik, that once in a while you are forced to do something like that. Now, I find this absolutely horrendous. What this means, this article says it all, and it was in the meantime said by the Pakistan Prime Minister Imran Khan at a speech to the OIC in Islamabad, that when the NATO left and the 80% of the budget was cut off, everybody knew what would happen. So it was not a mistake. Now we are 5 months afterwards. The country is starving to death. It's the worst humanitarian crisis ever. And everybody knew it. All the media knew it. All the governments knew it. And I really think that this is more than a question of US prestige. I think what has happened now is that it has dawned on some people that, given the fact that with the OIC, 57 Islamic countries are looking, what is the West doing? The US and the European countries who were in the form of NATO for 20 years there, who left a country in shambles, it's now turning out that if the West is not changing their act very quickly, this will be the moral downfall of the great liberal democracy. I mean, we have to really let it sink in. This is not the Taliban, this is not Russia, this is not China who are responsible, but this is a deliberate action where the West wanted to punish the government in Afghanistan, but they punish the people, the population. This is bordering genocide. So, I really want to say this in the starkest possible terms, because we have to shake up the world public that this incredible injustice has to be addressed. The UN General Secretary Guterres just a few days ago appealed to the United States that they absolutely must release the funds, that they must help to overcome this incredible humanitarian crisis. So I want to add a dimension to that, because sure, it is realpolitik to say the Taliban is there, and nobody should wish that the Taliban should be overthrown, which some people are also thinking about, because if you are trying to get rid of the Taliban now with the means which did not function for 20 years, do you want to throw this poor country of Afghanistan into another civil war? I mean, there has to be an end to this geopolitics. So I want to introduce another approach. And that is, I have called this operation to save Afghanistan Operation Ibn Sina. Now, in the Muslim world, one doesn't have to explain to anybody who Ibn Sina is. In Europe, you would not have had to explain it, at least not until a certain time ago, because Ibn Sina, who was one of the towering giants of universal history in general, he was also known, very known in Europe as Avicenna. Now, he lived from 980 to 1037, so about 1,000 years ago. And he was a wonder child. He knew the Quran when he was 10 years by heart. He was born in Afshana, near Bukhara, which is today Uzbekistan. His father comes from Balkh, which is near Mazar al-Sharaf, so what is today northern Afghanistan. And, he basically was educated this was the golden age of Islam. So what started with the Abbasid dynasty in Baghdad around 750 after Christ, then in this period, you had the incredible translation of all the Greek classic scholars of the classical Greek. You had many people who were either in the tradition of Aristotle, the Peripatetics, or of Plato, the Neoplatonics, and Avicenna, Ibn Sina knew many of those, especially Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, but also he read the Almagest from Euclid, Ptolemaios, and Euclid's books. So he was extremely educated, and very quickly he developed the talent to be a great physician, and he was able to heal many of the leading people around him. So he had access to the top libraries of the top emirs, and in any case, he developed a very important philosophical conception, which is that of the necessary existent. This is a very profound conception. Basically, it's a theological discussion about the eternity of the universe and why there has to be a final cause, which is responsible for everything which is contingent in the universe. Now, this would go too far from the seminar right now. I just made a speech about it, which you can hopefully find soon in the internet. But he is most famous, naturally, for the fact that he was one of the great physicians of all times. He was on the same level, if not greater, than the Greek physician Galen, Hippocrates, and he developed a whole medical science, which he wrote down in the famous Canon of Medicine, which was immediately translated in the 12th century into Latin, into Spanish, which influenced European medicine and Islamic medicine until the 18th, 19th century. He developed knowledge about many new diseases like cancer, diabetes. He had an absolute knowledge about the anatomy. He developed 760 medicines. In any case, he was an absolutely fantastic physician, and he was the one who discovered the importance of quarantine. Now, this is how I remembered him, because we have a pandemic, we have COVID-19, and to have quarantine is one of the most important ways to fight infections. And it was Ibn Sina who discovered it. There's a beautiful movie, an old movie from 1956, which I can only advise you to look at. It's called Ibn Sina, and it is the story of Ibn Sina explaining, to his contemporaries how you have to isolate, how you have to wash your hands, how you have to have hygiene. In any case, this has been published by the Uzbekistan government. And if you want to have a sensuous impression about Ibn Sina, you should watch this movie and listen to my presentation about his life. So I said, we have to call this effort to save Afghanistan Operation Ibn Sina. Because what does Afghanistan need? They need a modern health system. They need modern hospitals to deal with all of these diseases. And the building of a modern health system has to be the beginning of overcoming the underdevelopment and the incredible collapse of the economy by rebuilding the economy in Afghanistan in the context of integrating it with the big projects of the neighbor countries, the Belt and Road Initiative, the extension of the CPEC economic corridor from Pakistan through Kabul to Uzbekistan, and the Cyber Pass and other projects. And there has to be an international effort to not only save the people now. I mean, we have to have an appeal to the world. The UN has demanded $5 billion to be sent immediately. This is the largest sum the UN ever requested for the immediate humanitarian crisis. That money has to be provided. The assets have to be unfrozen. But then I appeal to all countries, but especially to the Europeans and to the United States, who have a tremendous moral responsibility, because we were there for 20 years, and you cannot just walk away from a country and just because you don't like the political system which has taken over and punish the population by killing off half of them or more. So I'm appealing to the world to join Operation Ibn Sina, and not only do the immediate humanitarian aid, but to build up the Afghan economy together with the neighboring countries, the Central Asian republics, Pakistan, Iran, but also naturally China, Russia, India, who all have an interest to stabilize this region, because Afghanistan is in a geopolitical, absolutely crucial spot, which is why the British, designed the Great Aim as a way to destabilize first Tsarist Russia, then the Soviet Union, and now hopefully, in their view, Russia and China. So this has to stop, and Afghanistan has deserved a bright future. And this is why I think Operation Ibn Sina is the best way to rally the forces to do that, because you need an exciting figure like Ibn Sina, who is, the pride of all Islamic people from the entire region, to rally around and make that the symbol of a beautiful future for Afghanistan. And if we can muster the moral resistance and fiber to do that, I think we will do the best to save our own civilization, because what will come out of this particular period of history is not yet decided. If we can be good in an area like Afghanistan, then there is a hope that we can solve the larger strategic crisis. So if we help Afghanistan now, it's the best thing we can not only do for the Afghan people, but for the future of all civilizations. So I'm appealing to you, join Operation Ibn Sina.
Thank you very much, Helga. and I just want to take a moment, first of all, to welcome everybody if you have just joined us. I want to introduce my co-moderator, Diane Sayre of the Schiller Institute. Diane is also famous for her founding of the Schiller Institute course in New York. And we're going to hear now from Ray McGovern. I hope we have Ray on. If we don't have him on, let me just say a couple things about him. There he is. Very good. He is the co-founder of Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, which I think is probably going to be one of the most meaningful things we'll be talking about today. He's provided, I think, a short video, which will probably give people an idea why that idea of an organization is so important. He was a CIA analyst for 27 years, a briefer of presidents, and he has a limited schedule. We're asking that we have, I guess, your video. You want me to show the video first, Ray? Did we do that first, or do you want
Let's
to
save
comment?
that. Let's save that for the last, if that's okay.
Sure, go right ahead then.
Okay. Well, thanks for having me on. This is truly a special occasion. I have taught a lot about Martin Luther King Jr. After learning a lot about him. And it seems terribly relevant here that we'll be talking about injustice. Injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere. The notion that we can be indifferent to this, this was mentioned earlier, that's a false claim. We cannot be indifferent to justice. I remember Rabbi Abraham Heschel, who, like Dr. King, who was very strong on opposing the unjust war in Vietnam. The quote is very, very to the point. When injustice takes place, few are guilty, but all are responsible. Indifference to evil, that is, indifference to evil, is more insidious than evil itself. And so I would just ask us all to keep that in mind. And the refreshing or the hopeful sign is that everyone tuned in here is not indifferent. They see the evil and they need to do something about it. Now, before I quote Dr. King himself, I want to quote his namesake, Martin Luther. He was on to this business about indifference, and his particular shtick, of course, was the church. He thought the church was abnegating its responsibility by letting wars thrive, by blessing this war or blessing that war. This is what Martin Luther said. If I profess with the loudest voice and clearest exposition every portion of truth of God except precisely that little point which the world and the devil are at the moment attacking, read Afghanistan, read Tonga, read all the things that are being neglected or being shown indifference by the West. If I am professing all this business, but I'm not following Christ, however boldly I may be professing him, it's where the battle rages. This is the point. It's there that the loyalty of the soldier is proved. So where the battle rages, if you're steady on all the battle except there, it is mere flight and disgrace if one flinches at that point. So he had together, and his descendant, Dr. King, had a very, very wonderful piece of writing from the jail, the Birmingham City Jail, which I crammed into all my courses. And here's the most neglected, in my view, and the most apropos quote that I would draw from that for today's purposes, and that is this. Quote, like a boil that can never be cured unless it is opened up with all its pus-flowing ugliness to the natural medicines of air and light, so too injustice must be disclosed with all the friction its disclosure creates to the air of national opinion and the light of human conscience before it can be cured. That's what I see ourselves doing today, trying to expose injustice to the air of national opinion and the light of human conscience. Now, once we do that, if we have enough success in spreading this truth around, things can change. Things do change. Let me just suggest that what is necessary is that the United States study its past, see the original sin of its racism, and see how it's playing out today. Now, I would point out that when Harry Truman, a racist through and through, this is no revelation, when he decided to kill hundreds of thousands of Japanese, he only had one supporter, and that was Jimmy Burns. Jimmy Burns was from South Carolina, and he was a racist through and through. So when Truman consulted Eisenhower, MacArthur, and other key figures of World War II, they all said, Mr. President, we disagree. This is unnecessary, and it's just the worst kind of thing you could do. He went with Jimmy Burns. Why? Well, because those Japanese, they don't look like us. They had been demonized, as so many people have been demonized by our media. And, we're going to win this anyway, so let's make believe we need to do this. And so we did it. A major mistake. Now, why did I say that Jimmy Burns was from South Carolina? That's because lots of this stuff comes out of South Carolina. No less than the general who headed up the Vietnam War, General William Westmoreland, sort of confessed after the war to what he really thought about the life of Orientals. Now, if that little clip is available and we can play it, it's only 4.5 minutes. I would ask people to look at it attentively and then reflect, and maybe we'll have a comment or two after. Could that clip be played?
Many bombs, many coffins. These are for children. 800 or 900 a week. I have lost 7 children myself. Many have died here. Though it's nothing like in the countryside, many more have died there. In the countryside, there are no coffins. There's no money to buy them.
How did all the children die?
Poison. Poison, you know. These planes keep spouting and spraying the stuff, and so many people have died. It seems to destroy their intestines. With this spraying and bombing, so many have died. Each day, right on time, the bomb craters appear. Hundreds of tons are dropped each day. And we can't talk about it. We can't talk about it because we are afraid of the government.
It can be described much like a singer doing an aria, you know, that's totally into what he's doing, you know, totally feeling it. He knows the aria, and he's experiencing the aria, and he knows his limits, and he knows whether he's doing it and doing it well. Flying an aircraft can be a great deal like that.
What's a race driver feel like? When does a guy want to drive an Indianapolis 500 and go charging around there? I guess perhaps the risk of dying, being killed, is part of it that makes it thrilling.
I can tell when the aircraft feels just right. I can tell when it's about to stall. I can tell when I can't pull another fraction of a pound, or the airplane will stall, flip out, and spin on me. I would follow a little pathway on something like a TV screen in front of me that would direct me right, left, or center. Follow the steering, keep the steering symbol centered. I'd see a little attack light when we stepped into attack. I could pull the commit switch on my stick, and the computer took over. Computer figured out the ballistics, the airspeed, the slant range, and dropped the bombs when we got to the appropriate point, in whichever kind of attack we'd selected, whether it be flying straight and level or tossing our bombs out. So it was very much of a technical expertise thing. I was a good pilot. You know, I had a lot of pride in my ability to fly.
Well, the Oriental doesn't put the same high price on life as does the Westerner. Life is plentiful, life is cheap in the Orient. And as the philosophy of the Orient expresses it, life is not important.
Is that the conclusion?
Well, no, let me just make a couple of comments on that. You heard Westmoreland. Am I on?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
You heard General Westmoreland, who conducted the war in a very duplicitous manner, who deliberately underestimated the number of Viet Cong and North Vietnamese under arms, who considered them, you know, the little patter of black feet was not going to make any difference to the great U.S. Now, that's out and out racism in its nature. And, you know, what it exhibits is that he's talking after the war, and he's being frank and candid in what he's talking about. So what we need to be is a little upfront and really, especially when we commemorate Dr. King, be upfront about what's really going on here. Now, I would like to cite very briefly a letter that Dr. King wrote to his sister, Angela Davis. The date was November 19, 1970. And Angela had just been caught. She was very much sought after. The law enforcement caught her, put her in chains, and her picture appeared on the front page or the cover of Newsweek. Now, James Baldwin in France wrote her a letter. I'll just quote one little sentence from it. He says, "Look, Sister Angela, let me put it this way." This is a quote. "As long as white Americans take refuge in their whiteness, they will allow millions of other people to be slaughtered. So long as their whiteness puts so sinister a distance between their own experience and the experience of others, they will never feel themselves sufficiently worthwhile to become responsible for themselves. Now, that sort of wraps up part of what this sinister racism accounts for. But also like to point out that when people look on from abroad, or people like Vladimir Putin, or people like Xi, the President Xi in China, what do they look at? Well, they see this, and they listen to the words of our presidents and our statesmen. One really very indicative, instructive, really, example of this was when President Obama's better instincts helped him prevent another war. All of his advisors, all of them, and all of the smart people in Congress wanted the U.S. to attack Syria openly with Tomahawk missiles. Why? Because they had crossed the red line, and it was a false flag attack to begin with. So what happened? Obama went up to St. Petersburg for an economic summit, and Putin put his arm around him and said, look, hey, Mr. President, we have arranged for the Syrians to destroy all their chemical weapons. How's that sound to you? Obama Kerry was without any of his real associates. That sounds really good. How can you do that? Well, they arranged it. These weapons would be destroyed on a U.S. warship specifically outfitted for such destruction. That prevented a war. Now, just at that time, Putin had an op-ed published in the New York Times. In the New York Times. The date was September 11th, 2013. September 11th is really just a coincidence. But what Putin says is, look, we avoided a war, and, quote, and my working and personal relationship with Mr. Obama is marked by growing trust. Growing trust. He said, I disagree, though. Disagree. This is the final paragraph of the op-ed. I disagree with the case he makes about America being exceptional. It is extremely dangerous. Now listen to this last part. A couple of sentences. It is extremely dangerous to encourage people to see themselves as exceptional. The United States, to see themselves as exceptional, whatever the motivation. There are big countries, small countries. There are rich and poor, those with long democratic traditions, and those finding their way to democracy. Their policies differ too. We are all different. But when we ask for the Lord's blessings, we must not forget that God created us equal, period, end quote. Now, I'm reliably informed that Putin penned that last paragraph himself. As we all know, regrettably, it was just a half year later when the people running our country prevailed on Obama to allow people to do a coup in Ukraine, and that's how we get where we are now. But what I would simply say is that this exceptionalism, which comes from the very people who landed in New England and Jamestown, is a real rot on our conscience. It's a real part and parcel of our racism, and it's got to be discarded all the more so since when you look at strategic realities now, there are three superpowers, and guess what? It's 2 against 1. Yeah, right. Russia and China against the United States. That's the way it has evolved, partly because the U.S. has acted so often as being an exceptional power. So what we need to do is what Dr. King called us to do, open this boil. Open this boil with all its pus flowing ugliness to the natural medicines of air and light, because injustice needs to be exposed to the light of human conscience and the air of national opinion before it can be cured. It can be cured. We have to enlist people like Martin Luther, as well as Martin Luther King, and get the churches to speak out in a way they did not speak out during the 30s when Hitler was gaining power. They should learn from that lesson. The institutional church, the synagogues, whatever should be speaking out. And I would just add that we just celebrated, if that's the right word, the 20th anniversary of our gross violation of human rights, the Magna Carta, every manner of human decency by establishing this penal colony in Guantanamo. And who are those people? Well, what distinguishes them to a man? They're all Muslim. So, racism is never far below the surface. We need to recognize that, and we need to be out front. We need to be able to suffer, as Dr. King did. Some of us maybe need to be such followers of justice that we suffer greatly, but we need to do it. And we can't say, well, there aren't enough of us. This is what Cesar Chavez, one of my heroes, who gathered the people, the grape pickers and all those people out in California, Central Valley. He says, look, whenever I say, let's do this, you all say that, well, yeah, but there's not enough of us. There are enough of us, but without action, nothing's going to happen. Now, I remember the grape boycott. That was action, and that worked, okay? So let's all figure out our own little way to do action, not just profess all this stuff, not just educate others to understand what's really going on, particularly racism, or to find some niche, find some group that we can cooperate with to change things. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ray. And I know you have to get going. Let me just ask Helga if she has any response at this point to what you had to say, or whether we should just continue.
Well, I think it's good that you're speaking out because, I think the whole world looks at the United States. That is the crucial factor, how this period of history will end up. So I'm happy what you are saying.
Thank you, Helga.
And thank you, Ray. We're just going to keep moving. And if you are able to stay, of course, we're happy to have you. And if people have questions for Ray McGovern, we've put it up several times, but we certainly will welcome your questions at schillerinstitute.org. So we'll move on here. Our next speaker is, I'm sorry, I almost forgot, Dr. Shah Mehrabi, member of the Board of Governors of the Afghanistan Central Bank.
Good morning. My name is Shah Mehrabi. I'm a member of the board of the Supreme Council, which is called another name is obviously Board of Directors of the Central Bank of Afghanistan. I'm also chairman of the Audit Committee of the Central Bank. In addition to that, I'm professor of economics at Montgomery College. I'm pleased to be with you this morning to go over at least three questions that I will pose, and I will provide answers as well. And one of the important questions that needs to be spelled out is that what were the conditions, mostly economic conditions that existed in Afghanistan prior to the new regime, in this case, Emirate to power. That's the first question that I want to address. And then the second question is what has transpired since Emirates have come into power. And then the third question that I want to go ahead and pose and then provide an answer to is what needs to be done. Based on what I have proposed since September, and has been widely reported by all media throughout the United States, as well as in Europe and Asia. And I will be focusing on these three questions. So let's start with the first question that I posed. And again, pose a question more specifically saying what were the conditions that existed prior to the new regime of Emirates that came into power. Now, these are the conditions that were prevalent during the prior regime. And one of the important point here is that we had a situation of conflict, obviously, that everyone knows conflict, that for 20 years that this country has endured, and that conflict resulted in massive exodus of many Afghans, and there was a strong demand for foreign currency that put a lot of pressure on the central bank to provide USD, that United States dollars, because people wanted to go ahead and leave. And so the total number of people that were internally displaced keep on increasing, by now some estimates about 4 million people and so on. So that was one of the important point, the conflict. The other issue also, what is very important here is that drought existed, the worst drought in 35 years by many estimates, according to the FAO. Also that there was a worst drought in 35 years, plus by our own data department at the central bank. In addition to, during this particular time of drought, is noted to keep in mind that it has been estimated that the harvest will be 25% to 30% lower than last year. And then also the scarcity has affected about 25 of Afghanistan, 34 provinces. I think that's important to keep that in mind. The third factor that existed in this period of time was the pandemic, with its effect on public health and the economy overall. I think that's an important point to keep in mind because that is still prevalent in Afghanistan. So, and if you look at the data that has been collected, only 7% of Afghanistan population is estimated to be vaccinated. I think that's an important point to keep in mind. Also, during this period of time, obviously, since this Afghanistan is a rentier state, it relied heavily on aid from the United States and Europe. All of that aid was halted. So halt to the development aid and security assistance, all of that was halted. Then obviously the other point, this is going into my second question, was that freezing of Afghanistan assets was done by the United States. So when you look at the situations of what existed overall, it affected the economy of Afghanistan in a negative way. So when Emirates came into power, they inherited these particular conditions, economic conditions that were prevalent and prior to their takeover on August 15. So how did the economy was affected by all these factors that I mentioned affected the economic growth of the economy in a negative way. And all the sectors of the economy were affected. If you look at it clearly in this case, looking at the agriculture sector, which is the most important sector in the economy, in that agriculture sector contributed about 27% of GDP, that is gross domestic product. So the sector clearly shows a negative growth in this particular area. And there are a lot of reasons that, and during the questions and answer, I would be happy to answer. The industrial sector also declined significantly. If you look at, again, the industrial sector in the amount of decline that is projected, these projections are made by our central bank. So when you look at it, because of the COVID-19 pandemic and then the political chaos that existed and the lack of confidence that was created as a result of this particular situation, we predict that industrial sector will decline again by double digit. And also the service sector is again has been affected, even though service sector contributes about 56.1% of the GDP of Afghanistan. And the sector really depended clearly also to a great extent on the investment that were done, and that investment and lack of confidence created a situation here where at least some of the service activities have come to a halt. And at the top of all that, obviously, is the trade sector. External trade has declined significantly. The trade deficit in Afghanistan is forecasted by against central bank to be about 33%. That is, so when you look at it, the total export and import, Afghanistan is an import-reliant country and imports more than export, and all the data shows that indeed you will see here is a reduction in both export and import that will continue to prevail in the economy. So these are to summarize to some extent what I said here that that even before the Emirates government took power, the Afghanistan economy was suffering from these conditions: COVID again, and pandemic, drought, severe drought, conflict, loss of investor confidence that has clearly disappeared, especially during this period of time. Now, when Taliban came over, they inherited this, or the regime came into power. They inherited these conditions in the economy, and all these conditions were deteriorated to a great extent because one was that the international aid, since Afghanistan relied heavily on international aid, because when you look at it here, we are talking about an economy that, over 40% of the economy really relied, 4% of GDP came from in this case, 40% of GDP was provided by 40 to 43 of GDP came from aid, and then also 75% of public expenditure was provided by others. So when Taliban regime came to power, all of that were halted. Aid was stopped. Development project ceased to operate, and the United States imposed sanctions and also froze the Afghanistan reserves. So these reserves, Afghanistan has 9.1 billion reserves as of August 30th of 2021, had 9.1 billion reserve, and majority of these reserves are in the United States, about 7.1, and the rest are in Europe, mostly in Europe and other countries. So those were all frozen by the United States. So the United States has decided up to this point not to go ahead and unfreeze these foreign exchange reserves. And that has created quite a bit of problem. And the reason it has created a problem because reserves were used for purpose of bringing stability and an exchange rate, as well as bringing stability in prices. And when the central bank does not have access to these, as I predicted back in September, two things would happen. You would see higher prices, which has occurred, double-digit prices. Then also that the value of Afghani vis-a-vis dollar and other currencies will depreciate and will go to a double-digit. That's what I predicted, and now the data show that that has occurred. Now, what we have seen here also is that people, higher prices that were controlled significantly by auctioning, by using the reserve that are rightfully and correctly are that the Afghans reserve. It does not belong to anybody else but the Afghan public. And ordinary Afghans must have access to this particular reserve to use it for the purpose of bringing stability in the prices so that people could afford to pay for the basic necessities of life. And they cannot at this stage do so because first, the prices have increased by double digit. And in the top of it, they don't have, many people have lost their income, so there's not enough, they not have ability to be able to pay for these goods and services, especially if they have gone up by double digit. Even for those who have income, their purchasing power will decline. So the ordinary Afghans should be not penalized overall. The ordinary Afghans have nothing to do with the regime, regardless of this regime or other regime. Two of the important things that actually has occurred since the Emirates have come into being. One is that the security was by many accounts has improved, and then the second thing that has also improved the corruption. So now, why should the Afghan people be penalized and not allowed to have access to their international reserve? Why allow the financial system to collapse? So, ordinary Afghans have nothing to do, as I said before, they have nothing to do with the regime, with the Emirates, and they should not be cut off from international having access to the reserve and to allow international financial system to go ahead and flourish and not put these people the state of misery as they are in right now in most of the Afghanistan public, or as all the report shows, will run into famine. And if nothing is done, they will be, obviously, as they have already started, there will be a massive exodus of many Afghans to Iran, into Turkey, into Europe. It will be a very costly situation for many European counterparts. So I will stop here and will entertain any question that you might have. And thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mehrabi. He will be available for questions. We'll be getting to that after we hear from a few other people. Next, we're going to have someone who's one of the founders of the Committee for the Coincidence of Opposites. And as I introduce her, Dr. Joycelyn Elders, I just want to say a couple of things. People have heard about the fire that happened a week ago in the Bronx, New York. 17 people died in that fire. There had been more than 24 violations at that building. We made the point in our invitation to today's seminar that the hundreds of thousands of children that are about to starve to death in Afghanistan, the cause for their deaths and the causes in the deaths in the Bronx are actually the same. It's what we keep calling depraved indifference. I think we saw a personification of that in the case of General William Westmoreland a little bit earlier. And the concept of when you look at healthcare and the kind of thing that Dr. Elders and others have been fighting for decades, the kind of circumstances we see not merely in the United States, but all over the world in the way in which this pandemic has not been properly dealt with, is the reason that we're calling ourselves to account today. People like to refer to this holiday weekend as a time of service. There's a thing in the United States called the day of service. You're supposed to be not a day off, but a day on. But the issue here is that here's somebody who's been on for decades as the former Surgeon General of the United States, and as she has helped in answering, I think, the very first person, answered Helga Zepp-LaRouche's call for the Committee for the Coincidence of Opposites. So, Dr. Elders, I see you're up there on screen. Welcome today, and we're happy to hear from you. Okay?
Thank you.
So go right ahead.
I think we've heard from a lot of excellent speakers. Helga gave us a real history of what it really meant to be about public health and how it came about thousands of years ago and who was the first started, and to make us aware of what we need to do, and that what we were doing is not necessarily unique to us, but it's really been brought up and talked about for years. First of all, I want to say good day to all of you who are assembled internationally for this important symposium. It's important to us. We've been concerned about it, worried about it, worked on it for years. And it's very appropriate, as far as we're concerned, that this discussion on stopping the horrific injustices taking place today in Afghanistan and numerous other places that's going on, around the planet, not only in Afghanistan, but many other countries, including the United States, and that we need to talk about the injustices that are going on this important holiday honoring Dr. Martin Luther King, who had the opportunity, I had the opportunity to hear him and to meet him many years ago, and he was always out there speaking. Primarily early, he really worked on young people. He gave many college graduation addresses, and he talked about what they needed to do and what they had to do in order to take their place in the world that was coming about, and the responsibility that they had to share. Dr. King spent his entire adult life in an effort to eradicate injustice. His immortal words, and you've heard it already today, but injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. What that means is that anywhere we see injustice going on and we fail to speak or fail to speak out, that means that we are not allowing injustice to come about. And the day we cease to speak is the day we begin to die, or our country. We lose a little. So it's important. We have to be loud and clear. This COVID imbalance has made many of us are very aware of what things are going on. These immortal words have exposed our weak underbelly of what we must need to do if we ignore any portion of humanity. It will come back to bite us. As I said at the onset of this pandemic, disease will always be with us. We need to try and make sure that it's short-lived. We need to have short-lived epidemics, not allow them to become pandemics. The only sophisticated solution to the COVID-19 crisis is potential and its multiple future variants, as we've seen, and new viruses, is a full modern health care facility in all nations and all systems. That is what Helga and the communities for the coincidence have stressed from the beginning of this pandemic. We need a modern healthcare system that provides health equity to everyone in the world. This means adequate, safe food and water, good doctors, good health care, good nurses. We cannot sit back and let indifference to innocent children freeze to death in Afghanistan. Our innocent children in the Bronx dying in the fires because of efforts to keep them warm in unheated apartments. I've been deeply disturbed by the recent horrific innocence of children from Afghanistan that I saw on TV, and correlated images from Africa and even here in the United States. Back in September of last year, we issued a statement in response to Helga LaRouche's declaration regarding the need of what we need to do and the problems facing Afghanistan and around the world. When we speak about the need for basic necessities for life, food, clean water, that this is the same for all people, regardless of where they are and what they're doing and what's going on. That's something that we must do. The needs of people for food, water, health care are the same, regardless to their government, regardless to where they are. The United States is currently withholding over $9.5 billion of Afghanistan people's funds from the Afghan Central Bank, as you heard from the central banker. A crucial first step is relieving this humanitarian crisis would be to release these funds. I'm happy to hear now that many international forces, including government leaders, United Nations officials, and members of the U.S. Congress, are adding their voices to the call to release these funds. This year marks the 93rd birthday of Dr. King. I'm sure if he was here and alive today, he would be joining this effort to try and campaign for a universal health care system and a justice for all Afghan, and is an immediate crisis that can be solved and can be served as a stepping stone to alleviate the poverty and misery for our fellow human beings throughout the globe. Let us not succumb to the disease of moral indifference. Those who get nothing, do nothing, get nothing done. Let's make a difference. Let's be the kind of nations that can make a real difference. We can make a difference. We have the know-how, we have the opportunities, we have the funds, we have the wisdom. And I think we need to step up, not step back. Step up, and as a nation, all join together and let this virus that's exposed our weak underbelly, let it not take over. Let us show that we're still in charge and we can overcome and we can make a difference in the entire world. Let's not watch people die while we sit and talk about what we should have done, could have done, or how we could have made a difference. I think it's the responsibility of all of us. And I'm very pleased that you're all joining with us on this important Martin Luther King birthday. Let's not run around just celebrating, talking about what we could have done, should have done, and need to do. Let's get up and start doing it for all people of the world. You've heard many of the speakers before me today talk about if we all join together, what we could get accomplished. We know what we need to do. Our leaders know what we need to do. And we want them to step up and begin to really be leaders. They have clarity of vision. They know what the problems are. They know how to do it. And it's time we began to make a difference and get busy doing it. So as we end the celebration of this day, don't just let it be another day where we walked out and celebrated and talked about what Dr. King said and should do. Let us decide, what are we going to do? We can all do something. And I think it's time we start doing it. Let's make the kind of difference we know we need to make, and we've got to make. Every nation can do something. Every nation has something to contribute. Some can do more, some less. Let's all do the things we need to do to get the job done that we need to make to provide the humanitarian aspect that we need to provide for the lives of people all over the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Elders. Thank you very much for that. And again, for people who have just joined us, we will be going to questions and answers. We are having, this is more of a seminar that we want to have. We have people from around the world on. We want to welcome all of you to this occasion called Injustice Anywhere is a Threat to Justice Everywhere, Stop the Murder of Afghanistan. Our next speaker is Graham Fuller. He's a former official of the Central Intelligence Agency and an Islamic scholar. Graham, are you there? Hello there.
Yes, I am. I
Good.
am.
Great. You now have the floor.
Thank you. I think it's quite incredible that this small country in the middle of the vastnesses of Central Asia should, century after century, really figure in international politics and war and conflict that seems to have no end. Afghanistan at least goes back in terms of Western consciousness to the great game between the British Empire and the Russian Empire, when the British, who were at that point masters and dominant in their colony in India, feared Russian invasion and possible upsetting of the British power in India. So there were a long series of wars. I won't go into the history of it, but suffice it to say that this so-called great game, and it's an ironic word that we talk about it as a game, because it really was lots of lives, lots of wars, lots of killing that took place in the course of this so-called game. In any case, this is the tragedy of Afghanistan and other countries in the world as well, but it is caught between the actions and ambitions of great powers, north, south, east, and west. And this has continued now right down to the present. I don't know where it will, when and how it will come to an end, but we seriously need to think about bringing an end to this very tragic course of events. Just let me mention very quickly the events of the last 20, 30 years. I lived in Afghanistan in the 70s when it was a joy to be there. It is a beautiful country. It is a very hospitable and warm and wonderful people, a beautiful country. And at that time, I and my family were lucky that we were able to travel around the country everywhere and appreciate its greatness and its wonderful qualities. But shortly thereafter, just before I left, the first terrible sin, if I may use that word, that set the ball rolling in the wrong direction for Afghanistan for another several decades was a foolish decision by one of two Afghan communist parties to seize power in Afghanistan in what had been an otherwise mildly autocratic government, but still relatively functioning government. As a result of this communist coup led by the Air Force, communists in the Air Force, the new government came to power. It was incompetent. After 9, 10, 11 months, they saw they couldn't even hold on to the country or administer it. They appealed to the Soviet Union to come in and help them, to save them. The Soviet Union invaded the United States at that point, and much of the rest of the Muslim world was deeply angered at this invasion, the effort to continue to impose a feckless not just communist regime, but a feckless and incompetent communist and brutal communist regime on Afghanistan. So began the long anti-Soviet struggle in which mujahideen were supported from all over the world by the United States and Pakistan and Saudi Arabia and many other countries. Finally, after 7 to 8 years, the Soviet Union finally learned its lesson. It pulled out, leaving the country, which then fell into civil war among the mujahideen themselves. So for another 7 to 8 years, this kind of brutal civil war took place. Finally, the Taliban, with support from Afghanistan, which was yet another one of these Islamist movements, was able to establish power across the country, put an end to the civil war, and at least make life marginally livable rather than in a constant state of war. Then, foolishly, the Taliban allowed Osama bin Laden a place in their country, even though he wasn't involved in the government. And we all know about 9/11, and the next thing we know, the United States had attacked and invaded Afghanistan for what has been another 20 years of military engagement in that country. And it's still not over, and now the Taliban are back, and it looks like the United States may be very unwilling, even vengeful in its sense of what has taken place there, with this front to the Taliban, by the Taliban against the United States as supposedly the number one great power of the world. This is tragic for the Afghan people, but it's a tragedy for the regime as well. I'm struck by the fact today that the United States' willingness to support denial of funds to Afghans, and we've heard about this now from several speakers, that the United States seems unwilling to consider and treat the terrible consequences, humanitarian consequences that are being delivered upon the Afghan people, who themselves were not responsible for any of these geopolitical adventures, but were victims of it. I'm also struck by the fact that the United States, it's ironic really, the United States has shared interests with 3 countries in the region that it considers to be enemies. Iran, with whom the United States has been undertaking an effort to overthrow that regime now for 30 years at least, Russia, and China. But yet, if we look at the situation, all 3 of these countries have included, and then 4th, the United States, have a serious interest in seeking stability, an end to terrorism, an end to civil war, and an opportunity for the region of Central Asia to develop through its new regional plans led by China of the Belt and Road Initiative. This Belt and Road Initiative, I think most people know, is the boldest and most ambitious program that Central Asia has ever seen since the days of Genghis Khan 1,000 years ago. It is an effort to unite all of the countries of Central Asia, which had been essentially backward portions of a Russian empire of several hundred years, an effort to unite them in a new economic framework. The United States, of course, has its difficulties and its hostility to many aspects of Chinese policies, Russian policies, and Iranian policies, yet we share with all 3 of those countries the same goal of seeing at least some peace and stability and an end to conflict and a chance for the region to flourish, which is in the interests of nearly everybody else. But as I started out, as I said at the outset, it is the tragedy of small nations not to be able to function as countries in their own right, but essentially to be manipulated by the great powers that surround them. I'm afraid, as much as we may condemn this reality, it does seem to be a human reality. And I am not sure that we are going to see a change anytime soon. So in this case, the United States has had not a shred of concern, nor have many other countries like Russia in the past or the British, had a shred of concern for the country itself, simply to buttress the geopolitical position of the United States or Russia or Britain or other countries in the future. That is, in fact, I think, the major reason why the United States ended up going to war in Afghanistan in the first place. Yes, 9/11 was a terrible event, and yes, the perpetrators of 9/11 definitely had to be punished, and that was the language used by the United States to support the invasion of Afghanistan. But I think if we look at the geopolitical realities much more closely, it's very clear, and it's on the record, that the United States really wished to establish a dozen or more bases, military bases around Afghanistan, which, as we know, sits right on the border of China and Russia. And therefore, the United States position would have been very powerful vis-a-vis exerting influence and pressure, if they wanted, on Russia and China. That is the real reason why we got deeply involved, and perhaps the reason why we stayed as long as we did. Yet this has not served American interests. The Chinese efforts and plans and programs to construct this Belt and Road Initiative through Central Asia is not in the US interests if we choose to interpret it as being against US interests. But are we condemned as a nation now, as our former great power role in the world continues to decline, and our moral standing continues to decline? Are we condemned to pursue a foreign policy that essentially is negative in character? When I look at US policy today in many regions, vis-a-vis Iran, vis-a-vis Syria, vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis Russia, and now perhaps vis-a-vis Afghanistan and many other places. These are utterly negative policies that, in my view, do not serve the interests of long-term global peace or stability or human welfare. I do not wish to suggest that China's policies are all magnificently humanitarian, but I would say that China's foreign policy so far has leaned towards trying to build new infrastructures from which China certainly benefits, but the region as a whole also benefits. So I think it ill behooves the United States at this point to be maintaining this kind of highly negative set of policies, which is determined to weaken China, weaken Russia, weaken the Taliban, weaken Iran, weaken Syria, and weaken any number of other countries. The United States is it should be a greater nation than that. We should be able to bring all of our technical and our organizational and financial and institutional and infrastructural skills to bear that can aid the positions of these countries. It does not have to be a zero-sum game between the United States and China, or between the United States and Russia, or any other number of these countries. The more you declare the other side to be the enemy, the more the other side begins to be convinced that indeed maybe they are the enemy, and that the United States, by calling them the enemy, may be to them the enemy as well. That is indeed a lose-lose situation. Hopefully, broader and more enlightened policies by the United States in this region, which should start by releasing these funds to Afghanistan so that the people are not starved throughout the winter, and might have a little more gratefulness to the United States than they're likely to have now. It is, to use the Chinese term, and it's not a Chinese term, it's a Western term, but China has picked it up, which is called the win-win solution, which means that seek out the common interests and work together towards these goals. Frictions, yes, friction will exist as long as the human race exists. But essentially, if we are looking at common solutions to common problems, I think it will make it much easier to solve the other frictions rather than simply focusing on them and pursuing widely negative policies as the United States seems to be doing today in a desperate effort to maintain its great power status, its hegemonic status against the rest of the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fuller. And what I just want everybody to know, because there are questions coming in, people should continue to send in your questions. We're going to have our final speaker today. This is Marcia Mary Baker from the Agricultural Desk of the Executive Intelligence Review, and we'll be following her with questions. I also want to point out that Marcia has been one of the main organizers of the Committee for the Coincidence of Opposites, which has taken some actions and some initiatives in both Africa as well as in Southwest Asia. So, Marcia.
Okay, and greetings to everyone on the panel and listening live around the world. And I think that the best thing I can do is start with one aspect of the means to life, namely food, and the fact of the structural injustice you see in Afghanistan. Because even before COVID-19 2 years ago, and even before this situation in August when the United States and NATO exited, and then you had the new government and so forth in the last 5 months. Even before that, the Afghanistan ranked for many years on what the World Food Program calls the map of hunger hotspots of the world, hunger hotspots, where you had really serious lack of food and malnutrition for many years. Now, to be exact about it, the Afghanistan, and I think it helps to visualize that beautiful country in your mind's eye. It's about the size of Texas, but it has spectacular features like the Hindu Kush and other mountain ranges. But what's happened is it's a wheat-oriented country. You know, I think it's number one in the whole world of the percentage of calories that come from wheat, from flatbread and so forth, on a routine basis. So wheat is major. And where were we as of the last few years in the production of wheat in Afghanistan? Well, it was way below what was needed, so it was import dependent. To be exact, I think about 5.5 million metric tons of wheat were being produced a year in the last 5 years. 2 years ago, it went up over 6 million metric tons. It was a good year. And then last year, as Dr. Mehrabi said, the drought was very intense and wheat fell by 25%, only 4.4 million or something tons. So what's happened routinely is you'd get commercial imports, mostly from Kazakhstan, from Pakistan in recent years, and then you'd get in-kind commodities coming in from the World Food Program and other agencies that could come from anywhere. It might come from France or some Russia. And it was donated, and you'd get some money, cash vouchers, it's called, from the World Food Program that could be given to people in the cities and farm households to be able to buy, to afford to buy what was available on the markets. That ended with a crash in August, and over the ensuing 5 months, with the freezing of the reserves of the nation, you had a lack of exchange, a lack of currency, a lack of work, and also the fact of, as Prime Minister Imran Khan said in December, when the Organization of Islamic Countries met in cooperation, met in Islamabad, once you just cold turkey stopped the 75% of the national budget as of last August of that nation from being able to expend anything, you've drawn down any wheat stocks that are there, any other food. Rice is less important, potatoes figure in it. You've drawn down everything. Plus you have people who don't have anything to buy, what can still be in the markets. So you have, over the 5 months, a complete crisis. What happened over that time, as you know, even though it's been blacked out until very, very recently, is the World Food Program's director, David Beasley, flew right away to Pakistan in August. He and Prime Minister Khan set up Islamabad as an air bridge hub for the World Food Program and 70 some other agencies to ship in more food. Also some cash vouchers. In November, they set up Dushanbe in Tajikistan as another hub. They have 6 cities or locations within Afghanistan as secondary hubs from which they have the trucks to distribute food. And they say before the snow fell in October, they were able to pre-position food to at least take care of some people in very rural, remote areas that ran out. So you have a scramble. Then came December. This Organization of Islamic Cooperation meetings agreed that they'd set up a hub. It would be in Uzbekistan near a border town. So that's the nature of what the World Food Program and collaborating agencies like the International Red Cross and the Red Crescent and others have been doing. Then secondly, what's happened is individual nations, have flown in or otherwise provided cross-border from Uzbekistan some literal food commodities. Russia did that. China did that. Saudi Arabia sent some in as nations, and money has been pledged. China pledged by September $31 million. The U.S. finally last Tuesday pledged $308 million, some for food, some for medicine, some for other things. So you have a situation where the functioning economy, as Dr. Mehrabi referred to, has been completely subverted. So the normal vendors and businesses that would engage in importing wheat, especially, don't have the credit to do it, don't have the income, can't pay for the shipping, can't pay for the insurance, can't pay for the storage. You have destitution among people, and you have a collapse of the normal functioning of the economy, as I said. Now then, but let's not forget one other thing. What was able to be produced in Afghanistan, again, you're dealing with a predominantly, amazingly wheat-oriented country, and the planting time in this latitude is in October and November for wheat that you harvest next June. It's called winter wheat, and it was very limited compared to what it ought to be if you're in a crisis. the ground was already dry. And unfortunately, next year looks like it's going to be very dry also because of world meteorological patterns. So what the Food and Agriculture Organization based out of Rome did is they went to about 31 of 34 provinces in Afghanistan, because wheat is attempted to be grown in a lot of places. It isn't all in one area. And they handed out special wheat growing packages of high yield seed and some other aspects to this. So we hope that will be helpful. But actually, you don't stop anywhere if you're going to end in injustice. You could plant spring wheat instead of that winter wheat whose time has come and gone. And you need to do that in March and April. You could be orienting to that. And otherwise, what I'm leading up to here is you can't go on where you're trying to have an entire nation survive on this emergency type aid, some of which is underway. You need the economy to be reestablished with the currency, the credit, the banking, the everyday accessibility of banking, and not just providing the food to save lives, but you need to build the capacity for the food to save lives. I imply that in terms of just the planting seasonality that I mentioned, but there's many more aspects, not to go into it here, but to indicate one. Potatoes, which don't go into world trade much, are also important in the nation. And for example, there's one particular province, Bamiyan, I think it's called, that supplies 50 to 70% of all the potatoes. If you move into that situation with a concerted effort, you could do the best you can with the best seed stock and add to the bridge of saving lives and also increasing the yield capacity for the future. Now, I'm not trying to present a comprehensive picture, but this is the physical side of what we're talking about has to be faced. And you have, when it comes to building what's necessary, there's even we appreciate that there's even been a chronic problem that Afghanistan has had to rely on imported flour, not just wheat, because it doesn't have the milling capacity to turn the wheat into flour. So this is something that could be rectified almost immediately. That's what I'm getting to here. Gives a concrete sense of why you need to have international collaboration. You need to do what's already been stressed here by many people, not just, you must release this frozen, the reserve funds and so forth of nearly $9 billion worth. You must end the sanctions that prevent any bank, any food importing establishment, any business from functioning. But you also must have collaboration on the volumes of food as well as medicines, vaccines, and water arrangements, temporary ones, in order to get by the current emergency, but to make arrangements to the future. Now that, I just have to say, what makes it even more clear is not within Afghanistan. But if you're saying that, here's some picture, that the nation only produced about 5 or 6 million tons of wheat reliably, and then imported less than 3 million tons usually. So it has less than 10 million tons of wheat. And just for the math, say there's 40 million people in the nation, which there's not, there's 38 million or fewer. But if you were going to, the rule of thumb is, you should have 500,000 tons of whatever grain preference is. In this case, it's wheat and some rice. So you should have 20 million tons a year in that nation. But you weren't even getting 10 million at the best of times in recent years. So look to a situation where, say, within a week, say Russia and China and the United States and India decided to collaborate along with France, Australia, other wheat producing nations, and you needed to get in there over time thousands of tons of wheat each week by train or by plane or in other ways, will you have it? Because we have hyperinflation in the world. We have the top wheat growing producing regions elsewhere, including Ukraine, France, other places like this, whose farmers are in trouble because they can't afford the fertilizer that wheat needs. And you may have this year on the world scale, maybe 10 million tons fewer wheat total, when out of the world only trades about 180 million tons of wheat that goes into trade. 700 or 800 million tons are produced, but much less goes into trade. And if we need it for Afghanistan, we sure better be producing it somewhere. That's why you need the nations to get together in the sovereign interest of saving lives in Afghanistan. And I have to say, for any farm person or friend of farming listening today live, whether you're in Italy or in Brazil or anywhere, this is an anti-cartel measure because there have been monopolies of food commodities, especially grain, that are infamous, that control basically how much is produced, where it gets bought and sold, and who gets to eat. So it's time the major nations, in the joint interest, as Professor Fuller just talked about, and as Dr. Elders alluded to, and Helga, it's time that we take these tasks, that we make them known to everyone, every average citizen everywhere. This is of deep interest. Break this, the fact that we haven't been collaborating, and start to collaborate now to save lives.
Thank you very, very much, Marcia. And what we're going to do now is bring everybody up on screen for our discussion. We've been getting a lot of questions, and we're going to try to get to as many of them as possible. We are going to be limiting what we're going to be doing to, a definite period of time, less than an hour, for these various questions. But we'll also, I'm sure, have some cross discussion among the panelists, which we'll start with. And I'll also just say, people are asking about how to join the Schiller Institute and some other things. We're going to go through that. We certainly think that if you have gotten anything out of what you've heard today, and you're here for this holiday, particularly around Dr. Martin Luther King, that happens to be why you are a junior. If you happen to be why you tuned in, best thing to do is to join the Schiller Institute, join this committee for the coincidence of opposites. And there will be ways for you to do that. We'll put that at the bottom of your screen. So I'd like to just bring everybody up, which is on the screen, if we could do that. And Diane, I'm going to go to you here in a moment for questions. But first, Helga, I'd just like to ask if you have anything you'd like to say in response to what you've heard, either from Dr. Mehrabi or Mr. Fuller, Dr. Elders, Marcia, or also Ray from earlier.
Well, I think that the idea that, the policies which have been pursued in the recent years by the United States were not in the interest of the United States. I think this is definitely an opinion which needs to be discussed, and I would really hope that we can. I mean, I can say the same thing for Europe, because a lot of the policies which were carried out by the European Union in the name of the European nations had the same effect. And I think, in doing this mobilization to save Afghanistan, it is a convenient time to reflect on what should be the principles of foreign policy. The Schiller Institute was founded, it's now 37 years ago, with the idea that we should have a foreign policy which furthers the best of the other, the interest of the other and the best tradition of the other, and vice versa, rather than thinking how to manipulate, how to regime change, color revolution, coups, all of this, and I think for me, this is the reason why I said Afghanistan is a branching point, is because it has gotten so far that I think that we have to be able to step back and say, are we the human species, or are we going to plunge into barbarism? And if we can join forces together in the way, Marcia, you just again, appeal to farmers and producers, that can become the beginning. And I don't think I'm foolishly idealistic, but I think it's the question is the human race able to govern itself according to principles which are in the interest of all of humanity, or are we barbarians? And I think this Afghanistan question poses this in the most immediate fashion, and I would really hope that it sparks an international debate, not only action, which we need very urgently to save Afghanistan, but also to reflect more deeply, what should foreign policy be? Are we not called upon to come up with a better idea how to engage in the knowledge of the other cultures, start to find out about it? And as was said, Afghanistan is a beautiful country, so are many other countries, and they have beautiful cultures. So if we could make the step of not pursuing geopolitical interests, but to make the step to become nations with a cultural dialogue emphasizing the best, I think we could write a completely new chapter in the history of humanity. And I would hope that this comes also out of this mobilization.
Yeah, thank you, Helga. Does anyone else have something they'd like to say at this point? If you do, please raise your hand, because that makes it easier for me. Yes, Dr. Mehrabi.
Yes, I want to go ahead and add to the point that Dr. Helga has made. I think is a very important point. You have to look at the United States interests. I think it's and the question needs to be put: does it really serve the interests of the United States not to release the international reserve that belong to Afghanistan? If you look at the past 20 years, I think it's look at the United States in European countries. They poured a lot of funds into building what at least was the objective of the United States, to build democratic institutions, prosperous democratic institution. But now what has happened here after 20 years, there's a clearly quite a bit of dissatisfaction by the United States with the fact that the results did not, or the fruit of all that investment did not really materialize in the way that they had projected it will. But that actually also say that that does it really serve the interests of the United States not to release the funds and not to go ahead and allow the banking institution to be able to provide the liquidity that is needed, so that the businesses could go ahead and pay for the imports. And I would think also along with this line is that there has to be a concerted and coordinated effort in cooperation, not only by the United States, because a lot of other countries, because of the fear, especially in the banking sector, because of the fear of the sanctions that will be imposed by the United States, they are hesitant to interact with the domestic banking institutions. So it doesn't pay to be able to not engage with the current regime, to be and cooperate in one way or another, and to be able to make a difference in a way where people are going to be able to go ahead and have access to buying the basic necessities and pay for them. And I think there's one argument that also along this line could be made, is that I think United States has a moral obligation. This country was destroyed vigorously, the moral obligation, and as well as I said, I think interest. Still is in the interest of the United States and others to be able to not allow Afghan people to run into this economic meltdown and trying to preserve some of the gains that are made in the past 20 years. And if, as we see, central bank that is operating very well, with civil servants who are perfectly capable of performing all the administrative and operational mandates that are given to them, why not go ahead and allow that to continue rather than trying to dismantle these institutions? So,
Okay, thank you, Dr. Mehrabi. Did anyone else have anything? If not, we have plenty of questions. So, all right, Diane, you're on. Why don't you get us started?
Okay. You want me to do three at once, or just
No, I think,
one?
I think you should probably just start with one and let's see who.
Okay. Good. I think this first one should be for both Helga and Dr. Mehrabi, and perhaps Mr. Fuller has thoughts too. Someone writes in, you did not address the potential of this funding to be used for terrorist activities that could harm the United States. I think if we release the funds, unfortunately, this is a real concern. Please comment.
Well, I think that the argument is really the person who asked this question has not thought it through. I mean, you may not like the Taliban, and I'm not even wanting to comment on is that my favorite party or not. That's not the question. Right now, the Taliban is the only existing force which can bring stability to this terribly war-torn country where the people suffered for 40 years of war. Can you imagine what it does to a country when you have two generations who are living under wartime conditions all the time? I think the little video clip which was shown by Ray McGovern about Vietnam, it should bring back the memory, what it means to live under war. And, now the Taliban is there. And, if you now try to destabilize the Taliban, what are you doing? And I heard some reports that the Storm is trying to make a counteroffensive. There are some people thinking about, encouraging other oppositions. Now you bring back terrorist organizations, which are, really terrorist organizations. The Taliban are only concerned about Afghanistan. They don't have an international inclination. But these other forces, which exist also, coming, from the ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and other groupings, then you invite terrorism and you invite the dope traffic, which the Taliban has proven in 2000 they are willing to give up if they are offered an alternative in terms of agriculture. So I think this is not well thought out through, and I would really ask the person who asked the question to reconsider that, because I think this is a narrative, but narratives have the characteristics that they are not the truth.
Okay, Mr. Fuller, you're muted. Mr. Fuller, go ahead. You were muted.
You're good.
Okay, now we.
If I could just add to that, I think what Helga says is very significant. Indeed, the Taliban, whatever their extremely conservative domestic Islamic policies may be, and whether we approve of them all or not. And I should add that we managed to get along very well with Saudi Arabia, which has very similar policies towards women and towards minorities and towards other religions as the Taliban might have, but we never hear anything about why we don't like Saudi Arabia because we have other interests there. In any case, the Taliban have not had an agenda of international terrorism. And the Al-Qaeda attack upon the United States in 9/11 had nothing to do with Taliban policies. In fact, the Taliban criticized them after the fact for what they did. Secondly, it doesn't take a lot of money to conduct terrorist operations. This can be any contributors to terrorism around the world are quite capable of doing this. So it's not as if money being given to the Taliban is suddenly going to be given to external terrorist organizations. The Taliban have learned a few things, I think, in the 20 years since they've been out of power. They were thrown out by the United States in an invasion and coup or government. They've been in exile for 20 years. They've had a chance to look back at all the mistakes that they made in earlier years. It's a younger generation. They have been visiting and traveling to China and Russia and Europe and the Middle East and the Gulf and all kinds of exposed to new ideas and demands about how to run a decent government. So I think the idea that the Taliban are suddenly going to take desperately needed funds and supply this to genuine terrorist organizations, such as Helga mentioned, as Al-Qaeda or ISIS or others, the idea that they would give those forces funds when, in fact, they threaten the Taliban regime itself. That's ludicrous. So I don't think this is a serious concern.
Okay, and Dr. Mehrabi, go ahead.
I think to the question that was posed, I think that there were very good response by my colleagues that were provided with regard to the new regime and also having access to these funds. I had, in order to build a trust between that is Treasury of the United States, which has actually frozen these assets, and in the current regime of Emirates, I had proposed back in September, in end of August, beginning of September, and I argued that this Treasury should release these funds. Otherwise, Afghanistan will run into immense poverty, which has already come into being. And more specifically, what I said is that what the United States should do is to release that is $150 million per month. That is $150 million per month out of 7.1 billion that is held in the United States, and this is roughly half of the reserves that Central Bank of Afghanistan, prior to Emirates coming to power, used to auction off, trying to stabilize prices and also bring stability in foreign exchange rate. Now, I also said, well, this is not that difficult for the United States to verify. If you want to know, as the person who's asking the question, what will happen with this fund? You can verify the funds and see what is it going to be used for. And in this case, it could be used for the purpose of stabilizing the economy, and all the transactions are done electronically. It is an impossibility not to be able to know where things are going to go, the funds are going. And also, I said, if at the top of it, you can have an independent audit company that are currently operating in Afghanistan to give you further verification. I think it's important to keep that in mind, indeed, that this could be done. And it should allow the institution of banking to be able to have this access to these funds. So also important, we have what is called in the central bank. We have FINTRACA, that is Financial Intelligence Unit of the Central Bank. They have been, that personnel, civil servant, been trained in anti-money laundering, what's called AML, CFT, in Afghanistan, adhere to all the rules and regulation with regard to any transaction that will take place between Afghanistan and the whole world. And that FINTRACA is operating very well. It is, there's a clear cooperation and coordination that still exists as it existed prior to regime of Emirate came into being. So there's no way that one could argue that this one could be used for any other purposes but to help the ordinary Afghans.
And it's been getting.
Let me just indicate that somebody wrote in. It was actually originally was going to be a question, but it said, as tragic as this sounds, the sick irony is that all this talk of, quote, we can't support terrorists and, quote, women's rights regarding Afghanistan, with the subsequent act of torturing the Afghan people, only fuels hate toward the United States and Western nations, thus recruiting terrorists. Do you think this is a conscious policy, and to what end? So that was a remark that came in the course of things that people may want to consider. Diane, I don't know if you have any other questions that cohere with that. Do you want to ask at this point?
One related, which is someone asked, does anyone on this panel think the United States should return to Afghanistan to provide stability?
If we're
Okay, so
talking,
go ahead. Go ahead.
yeah, I'm on. Yeah.
Yes.
If we're talking about returning to a wartime situation, I think that would be the ultimate folly, really. I mean, after 20, if we couldn't do what we if we couldn't accomplish 20 years of full domination of the country and massive military and technical and intelligence and financial support, I don't know what we could possibly do by a return. I think what I worry about is that hardline elements within the U.S. government, neoconservatives and people like this, might decide that they would like to spark some domestic uprising and maintain a constant, let's say, civil uprising against the Taliban in order to overthrow them. I guess in theory, it's possible to overthrow the Taliban, although they've been pretty capable in keeping the lid on and winning the war so far. But I would argue that to plunge the country back into more war and more chaos, we all know that this is the perfect breeding ground for greater resentment, anger, and of course, terrorist and radical action.
Okay. Anyone else? Helga?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, if the strongest military power of the world, the United States, plus NATO, cannot win against what really boiled down to 65,000 Taliban fighters, I mean, it just does not make any sense. And I think the only conclusion is that, Afghanistan needs now, as a sovereign country, to take care of its own fate. And, I think the neighbor countries are demanding an inclusive government. Hopefully the Taliban will move in this direction to make sure that, all the different factions and tribes and groupings are represented. But I think it has to be a situation where, the sovereign power of the Afghani people have to be strengthened. That's the only hope. And I think that the only reason why you would go in the direction of, thinking to go back or strengthening the opposition to the Taliban is to continue the great game, to use the Afghanistan people for the great game against Russia, against China. That is definitely a danger. And, we know that there are certain forces who have said so, more or less, like in Great Britain and elsewhere. But I think, that would be a part of the great game. And I think the situation is more promising because I think, reasonable military leaders would not try to repeat something which clearly was the biggest failure in history ever. I mean, this was the biggest defeat of NATO since its existence. And in the meantime, you have a very strong alliance between the United States and China, which is also a new factor in the situation. So I cannot imagine that any serious American military planner would actually think to go back there.
I've also just been told, we'll come to you in a minute, Dr. Mehrabi, but I've also just been told we have Dr. Phil Matin Baraki with us now. Is that the case? Okay, from the Center for Near and Middle East Studies at the Institute for Political Science of the Philipps University in Marburg, Germany. Is that you, sir? Because I see someone up I haven't seen. If so, welcome. But Dr. Mehrabi, you were going to say something. I didn't want to interrupt you. Sorry.
I think I wanted to add was the point that was raised, and I think again my colleagues did a very good job of explaining that. But I think it's United States will always consider their interests before engaging in any activity, and re-engaging in war obviously is, again, most likely would be based on the self-interest. Now, the self-interest of the United States in this case would be obviously look at the, they have to think very clearly about the long-run cost overall. There's no doubt here that when you look at the 2 decades of wars, that is the blood and the treasure the United States expended and did not really materialize in the initial objective that the United States set for. And what would be the argument to go ahead and engage in another 10, 20 years and incur significant cost? And would it be able to avoid any of the problems that could not, they were not resolved during the last 20 years? Will they be able to go ahead and do that in the future? Now, there's definitely cost also that I said in the video overall, the cost that our allies are going to be faced with, and that is massive migration, and that will be extremely costly. So the best solution, obviously, as I've argued, is to let build and not destroy that what has been built, not to be destroyed. These are institutions. In this case, the Afghanistan Bank and Ministry of Finance. Let's not dismantle them, and let's not let them disappear. It will happen if these issues of funding is not addressed on a permanent basis, not on a short-term piecemeal basis of concentrating only on humanitarian aid.
Okay, and I think we're going to be going to Dr. Baraki right now. If we're ready for that, technically, I think we have to have a simultaneous translation, or not simultaneous, but consecutive translation from German. Is that right?
Okay. Can the translation be heard?
Yes, we can hear you. That sounds like Alexander.
Yes, I'm ready.
Okay, great. Okay, go ahead, Dr. Baraki.
Ja, vielen Dank. Schönen Abend zusammen. Und ich bedanke mich ganz herzlich, dass ich mitdiskutieren, teilnehmen durfte. Ich sehe meine Aufgabe darin, die geostrategische Hintergründe des Engagements der Vereinigten Staaten in Afghanistan und auch der NATO darzulegen. Also,
lassen Sie mich das kurz übersetzen. I'm happy to be with this conference this afternoon, and I see my role in looking at the strategic role of the United States and the situation in the region.
Afghanistan war immer eigentlich ein armes Land, und das Einzige, was dieses Land hat, war immer seine geostrategische Bedeutung.
Afghanistan was always a poor country, and the only thing that it had was its geostrategic importance for the other countries.
Ja, von der Antike angefangen bis heute. Alexander der Große, der nach Indien wollte über Afghanistan. Die Briten im 19. Jahrhundert wollten Afghanistan besetzt hatten, die Region des Mittleren Ostens zu kontrollieren. Die Sowjetunion hat interveniert 1979 auch unter dem Gesichtspunkt der geostrategischen Bedeutung. Und auch die Vereinigten Staaten haben unter diesem Aspekt in Afghanistan militärisch interveniert.
This has been so since antiquity. Alexander the Great wanted to go to India through Afghanistan. The British went into Afghanistan for the geostrategic position vis-a-vis Russia. The Russians have moved into Afghanistan for geostrategic reasons, and it's the same motive for the United States when they moved into Afghanistan.
Ja, jetzt ist die Frage, was ist eigentlich in Afghanistan passiert, dass die Lage so ist, wie wir es heute erleben?
So the question is, what happened in Afghanistan so that the situation became what it is now?
1978 haben Offiziere der afghanischen Armee einen Aufstand gemacht und eine Partei, die Herr Graham Fuller als Kommunisten bezeichnet hat, an die Macht gekommen.
In 1978, a group of officers made a putsch and brought in a party which Mr. Fuller termed communist, was brought into power.
Aber diese Partei war keine kommunistische Partei, die haben sich auch nie Kommunisten genannt, sondern das ist eine Erfindung der CIA. Die CIA hat die Partei als Kommunisten eingestuft.
So this, in fact, it was not a communist party. They did not consider that themselves, but the CIA declared them to be communists.
Dadurch konnte man die Leute mobilisieren, die Afghanen mobilisieren und sagen, hier, diesen Kommunisten, euer Glaube, eure Religion, Islam ist in Gefahr.
So the idea was to mobilize the people in Afghanistan against the communists, telling them that the communists were threatening their religion.
Dafür hat dann Brzezinski gesagt, wir sollen die Mujahideen erfinden. Der Brzezinski ist Erfinder der Mujahideen.
And that's why Brzezinski said we have to invent the Mujahideen. In fact, Brzezinski is the inventor of the Mujahideen.
Ja, was haben diese sogenannten Kommunisten machen wollen? Afghanistan war sehr rückständig, unter feudalistischen Verhältnissen haben die Menschen gelebt und die haben gesagt, wir wollen das feudalistische System reformieren.
What these so-called communists want to accomplish, they said Afghanistan is a terribly backward country, and they wanted to move the country forward and develop it.
Die wollten Bodenreform durchführen.
They wanted to have a ground reform, redistribution of the ground.
Über 90% von Menschen konnten nicht lesen, schreiben. Die wollten den Menschen lesen, schreiben beibringen.
More than 90% of the people could not read or write, and they wanted to change that.
Afghanistan ist ein islamisches Land. Die Männer dürfen 4 Frauen haben. Diese Regierung sagte, jetzt machen wir das nicht mehr. Ab heute ist verboten, Polygamie ist verboten.
And Afghanistan, as an Islamic country, allowed until then that every man could have up to 4 wives. And the new government said we stopped that. We don't have polygamy anymore.
Ja. Herr Kissinger sagte, wir müssen aufpassen, was in Afghanistan passiert. Wenn Afghanistan Schule macht, dann wird die gesamte Region revolutioniert, dann ist unser Öl in Gefahr.
And Henry Kissinger then said that we have to look at what is happening in Afghanistan, because if that succeeds, then it becomes a model for other countries, and then our control over the oil resources is threatened.
Dann hat man die Mujahideen unterstützt. Jedes Jahr wurde 65.000 Tonnen Waffen nach Pakistan geschickt, damit die afghanischen Mujahideen gegen die afghanische Regierung kämpfen.
And then the Mujahideen were supported with 65,000 tons of armament every year that was shipped through Pakistan to Afghanistan, so that the Mujahideen could fight the government.
Aus 50 islamischen Ländern, aus den arabischen Ländern wurden Mujahideen nach Pakistan gebracht und diese Leute haben dann Al-Qaida gegründet mit der Unterstützung der CIA.
And from 50 countries in the world, Muslims were brought through Pakistan to Afghanistan to the Mujahideen, and that is that became then the Al-Qaeda group that is threatening world peace.
Osama bin Laden war eng befreundet mit der Familie Bush, der hat für die Häuser gebaut in den USA sogar.
And Osama bin Laden they were working very closely with the CIA. And Osama bin Laden was in fact very closely a friend of the family Bush. He built housing or houses for them in the United States.
Als die afghanische Regierung gemerkt hat, dass die Gefahr besteht, dass sie gestürzt werden, die haben mit der Sowjetunion einen Freundschaft- und Beistandvertrag geschlossen im Dezember 1978.
And when the Afghani government recognized that there is a threat to it, they made a friendship and assistance treaty with the Soviet Union in 1978.
Und es bestand die Gefahr, ich habe Dokumente, habe ich auch veröffentlicht, dass von Pakistan aus Mujahideen mit Hubschrauber nach Kabul gebracht werden sollen und von Fallschirmen springen sollen, um die afghanische Regierung zu stürzen.
And there were plans that the Mujahideen should be flown in from Pakistan with helicopters to Kabul to topple the government and to bring the Mujahideen to power.
Ich habe Dokumente, nachdem die Sowjetunion weg war, habe ich Dokumente von Archiv der Kommunistischen Partei der Sowjetunion, dass die afghanische Regierung insgesamt 21 Mal die Sowjetunion um Militärhilfe gebeten hat.
And Dr. Baraki has documents that were released after the collapse of the Soviet Union that the Afghani government asked for military assistance from the Soviet Union 21 times.
Das letzte Anfrage war am 17. Dezember 1979.
The last time in November 1979.
December.
December. Sorry.
Und als dann die Gefahr bestand, dass die Regierung gestürzt werden sollte, dann hat die Sowjetunion interveniert, militärisch interveniert.
And when there was indeed a danger that the government would be toppled, the Soviet Union intervened militarily.
Brzezinski ist gefragt worden, ob die USA, ob die CIA die Mujahideen unterstützt haben. Haben sie gesagt, naja, wir haben die CIA unterstützt und ich habe Jimmy Carter gesagt, wenn wir das tun, dann wird möglicherweise die Sowjetunion intervenieren. Aber wir haben die Sowjetunion nicht aufgefordert zu intervenieren, aber die Möglichkeit, dass sie es tun, haben wir es wissentlich erhöht. Wir wollten, dass die Sowjetunion interveniert.
And this was the intention of Brzezinski. The CIA supported the Mujahideen with the idea that to provoke the Soviet Union. They did not ask the Soviet Union to intervene, but they wanted to provoke that, and they did provoke that.
Als dann die Sowjetunion interveniert hat, dann wurde der Afghanistan-Konflikt internationalisiert und dann bis Gorbatschow an die Macht kam, haben die Sowjetunion da diesen Krieg weiter durchgeführt und die Mujahideen wurden von USA, anderen NATO-Ländern und arabischen Ländern unterstützt.
So the whole conflict became internationalized, with the Soviet Union being militarily present and participating in a war against the Mujahideen that was supported by many countries in the West.
Als Gorbatschow in der Sowjetunion die Macht übernommen hat, in Genf kam es zu einer Verhandlung zwischen Pakistan und Afghanistan. Sowjetunion und USA waren Garantiemächte. Die haben beschlossen, die sowjetische Armee aus Afghanistan abzuziehen.
And when Gorbachev came to power, there was a meeting in Geneva involving the Afghani government, the Pakistani, and they came to an agreement that was guaranteed by the US and Russia that the Soviet military forces would be withdrawn.
Sowjetunion und USA haben sich verpflichtet, ihre jeweiligen Partner nicht zu unterstützen. Die Sowjetunion hat praktiziert, ihre Armee aus Afghanistan abgezogen, aber die USA haben weiter die Mujahideen unterstützt.
Both Russia, the Soviet Union, and the United States promised to not further support militarily the conflict parties in Afghanistan. And the Soviet Union withdrew their forces and stopped supporting the government, while the US broke the word and continued to support and aid the Mujahideen.
Die afghanische Regierung unter Präsident Najibullah hat gesagt, also dieser Krieg hat keinen Sinn mehr.
The Afghani government under Najibullah said it doesn't make any sense to continue this war.
Wollte das Land verlassen, ist geflüchtet in die UN-Vertretung in Kabul. Die Taliban, als sie nach Afghanistan kamen, dann haben sie umgebracht.
And he took refuge in the UN mission in Kabul. When the Taliban came to power, they killed him.
Die Nachfolger von Najibullah haben die Macht übertragen an die Mujahideen.
The people who followed of Najibullah then gave the power to the Mujahideen.
Die Afghanen haben gesagt, das ist sehr schön, die Sowjets sind weg, die linke pro-sowjetische Regierung ist weg, jetzt ist unser Bruder Mujahideen gekommen, jetzt wird alles gut.
And the people in Afghanistan said, well, the Soviets are gone and the communists are gone, and now everything is going to be well.
Was nicht gut geworden ist, das war Afghanistan. Die Mujahideen, 6 Gruppen aus Iran, 6 Gruppen aus Pakistan sind gekommen, die haben nicht gemeinsam regiert, sondern gegeneinander gekämpft, und in Kabul wurden 50.000 Menschen umgebracht.
But nothing was well. The Mujahideen did not form a government, but they were 6 groups supported by Iran, 6 groups supported by Pakistan, and they just started a civil war among each other and destroyed the country.
Kabul wurde so gestört wie die großen deutschen Städte im Zweiten Weltkrieg.
Kabul was destroyed as much as the big cities in Germany during the Second World War, and I think 50,000 people were killed.
Und irgendwann war dann die Sowjetunion nicht mehr da.
And then at some point the Soviet Union ceased to exist.
Und die Firma Unocal, ein Energiekonzern in den USA, Dick Cheney war im Aufsichtsrat von Unocal, haben gesagt, wir wollen jetzt in Mittelasien und Kaukasus die Gasreserven und Ölreserven ausbeuten.
And the company Unocal, that is an oil and gas company where Dick Cheney was in the board, they said, we want to get access to these raw materials in Central Asia.
Die wollten von Zentralasien durch Pipeline nach Südasien diese Rohstoffe durchführen.
And they wanted to create a pipeline that would bring these raw materials from Central Asia to South Asia to the ocean.
Die Mujahideen haben Krieg gemacht, die sind eingeladen worden zum Auswärtigen Ausschuss des US-Kongresses. Man hat denen gesagt, ihr sollt mit dem Krieg aufhören, ihr könnt davon auch profitieren, dann könnt ihr Geld bekommen von uns.
And but the Mujahideen made their war, civil war, and then they were called into the U.S. to discuss this, and they were told, if you make peace, we can build that pipeline, and you can participate and profit from it.
Die haben gesagt, ja, mit dem Krieg machen wir es zu Ende, aber die haben den Krieg durchgeführt. Und danach dann hat die CIA gesagt, wir haben doch die Taliban als Reserve, dann schicken wir die Taliban nach Afghanistan, die sollen die Mujahideen vertreiben.
But they continued to have their war, and so the US said, well, we have as a reserve force the Taliban, and we can support the Taliban to get rid of the Mujahideen.
Die Taliban sind gekommen und zuletzt haben sie 90% des Landes unter Kontrolle bekommen.
And then the Taliban moved in, and they at some point controlled 90% of the country.
Aber der Krieg hat nicht aufgehört.
But the war didn't stop.
Deswegen konnte die Firma Unocal diese Pipeline nicht durchziehen.
So the Unocal could not build the pipeline.
Ja. Und dann Präsident Clinton sagte, wir wollen einen Krieg gegen die Taliban.
And then President Clinton said, we need to have a war against the Taliban.
Aber die Russen müssen das akzeptieren, mittelasiatische Republiken sollen ihre militärische Infrastruktur zur Verfügung stellen.
But the Russians have to accept that the Central Asian countries would provide the logistical basis for the military operations in Afghanistan.
Die Länder haben das nicht gemacht. Das war dann die Endphase der Regierung von Clinton. Dann haben wir gesagt, das lassen wir jetzt. Ruhe ausruhen.
And these countries refused to do that. This was in the late part of the Clinton administration,
Ja, also das war Bestandteil der Strategie von Brzezinski, der nach dem Ende der Sowjetunion entwickelt hatte, die einzige Weltmacht. Nach dem Ende der Sowjetunion ist die USA die einzige Weltmacht. Wir wollen die Politik in dieser Region bestimmen. Das war Teil dieser Strategie.
So this was part of Brzezinski's strategy, who said that the only superpower should be the United States, and the United States should dictate the policies in the region, including Central Asia.
Alexander, we're going to have to summarize. Could you just let him know, because we have, unfortunately, we only have about 20 minutes left. We've got to get back to
Dr. Baraki, wir haben leider nur noch etwa 20 Minuten überhaupt für die gesamte Veranstaltung. Also wenn Sie sich etwas kürzer fassen können.
Gut, ich mache es kürzer. Ja, dann danach haben die Bush-Administration hat die Greater Middle East-Strategie entwickelt, und im Rahmen dieser Strategie haben die auf einen Anlass gewartet, um diese Strategie umzusetzen. Der Anlass war der 11. September.
So the Bush government had a different strategy. They waited for an event that would be a pretext to move in, and that was the September 11th.
Ja. Und danach, wir wissen, dass die USA dann mit dem Krieg begonnen haben, 20 Jahre Krieg gemacht und nichts gebracht. Dieser Krieg hat nur Zerstörung gebracht. Viele Amerikaner sind gestorben, Afghanen sind gestorben, als NATO-Länder, und Milliarden, Billionen von Dollar gekostet.
So the result was 20 years more of war. Hundreds of thousands of people died. The billions of dollars were wasted on 20 years of war.
Jetzt, welche Faktoren haben die Rolle gespielt, dass die USA aus Afghanistan abgezogen sind? Das will ich erklären.
So to the end, I just want to go into why the United States have left Afghanistan right now.
Das erste war, der Krieg wurde zu teuer.
The first was the war became too expensive.
Zweitens hat schon Obama die Strategie geändert, sagte, Pazifik ist für uns wichtiger als Nahen Osten.
Second, Obama changed the strategy and said the Pacific is more important for us than the Middle East.
Die künftige Weltpolitik wird am Pazifik bestimmt.
The future of world politics is played out in the Pacific.
Wir müssen schauen, dass wir, wenn wir China nicht zurückdrängen, zumindest stoppen, die Entwicklung in China stoppen.
We have to push back China, if not throw it back totally.
Obama hat das nicht umgesetzt, aber der Trump hat das umgesetzt. Hat er mit den Taliban Gespräche geführt und zu einem Ergebnis gekommen, dass eben die US-Armee aus Afghanistan abgezogen werden soll.
And the United States then they did not complete that under Obama, but Trump made indeed the decision to withdraw from Afghanistan in order to move the forces to the Pacific.
Ja, die USA sind aus Afghanistan abgezogen, ungeordnete Verhältnisse hinterlassen, dann haben die dem afghanischen Volk als Geschenk die Taliban überreicht.
And the United States created chaos in Afghanistan. They chaotically withdrew, and they basically donated the country to the Taliban, or they donated the Taliban to the country.
Und jetzt muss das afghanische Volk mit diesen Taliban fertig werden.
And now the country has to deal with the Taliban.
Ja, und was machen die USA jetzt? Die nehmen Rache. Statt die Taliban zu bestrafen, die bestrafen das afghanische Volk. Darüber haben andere Kolleginnen und Kollegen gesprochen.
And instead of what the United States are doing now is simply revenge, punishing the whole people, punishing not the Taliban but the whole people.
Was die machen eigentlich, das ist eine Bestrafung des Volkes und in Afghanistan werden Menschen ermordet und verhungert. Ich höre hier auf. Ich danke Ihnen ganz herzlich für die Aufmerksamkeit.
I stop at that and thank you for your interest.
We want to thank Dr. Baraki for doing this. What we'll do with the presentation is we will put it together, splice it so that people actually can follow, because we have the simultaneous translation. So we just wanted to thank you for doing it, and if there's other things that should be added, we'll certainly appreciate that. Diane, I'm going to go back to you. Oh, and let me just say to everybody, we're going to be concluding within 20 minutes. We're combining some questions now because of time, and we're going to go to Diane, who will begin.
Okay, good. So this, I think it's three of them very much directed toward Dr. Elders. Also, Helga will have thoughts, and Marcia. Let's see. Okay, first one, I think, sparked by Ray McGovern, saying, I understand where Ray McGovern is coming from on his critique of American exceptionalism. It has been bastardized to justify atrocities against many people, and there's a long list of wars. I will agree it's beyond disgraceful and shameful, and I'm quite perturbed that many Americans are not aware of this, or they downplay them, or even try to justify them. However, could it be true that the idea of American exceptionalism be used for the United States to do good in the world, especially with the ideas that Franklin Roosevelt had in mind for post-World War II, or that Martin Luther King had in mind for the United States during his speeches, or as we understand the identity of the United States from the ideas of Lyndon LaRouche? So that's one question. And then another question on the Operation Ibn Sina seems to be what is needed worldwide. We are hearing that the COVID figures may stop being recorded in the United States, but the virus mutations aren't going to be stopped by that. And we have no idea around the world about how people around the world are going to be protected. What can we do to move the world toward this cooperation? And then finally, another person asked about the question of Ibn Sina with regard not only to modern health systems, but of course related to that, nutrition and agriculture. How can we ensure that the farmers in Afghanistan are able to produce wheat and the other crops they need? And could we get some kind of cooperation to take advantage of the fact that you do have different seasons in different hemispheres of the planet? So maybe there's a way to get nations where it is warm to start producing for those who are not in their growing season. So that's quite a bit.
Since
So maybe
Helga, I'll let you answer, since that a part of it, since I felt that it was directed more to you. And then Diane, you know more about the growing of wheat. Those all of those questions are kind of out of my expertise. I will say the only thing I will add to that is just say that I think that every country should really do the very best they can, and if we all reached out and used our exceptionalism and expertise to really make a difference overall, that we would all be better off.
On this COVID question, or maybe you want to say,
no, go ahead.
That the U.S. has stopped. The U.S. says it's not going to record cases anymore, and won't this have an impact on the rest of the world? And shouldn't we be doing something about that?
Can I answer to that?
Please. Yeah, go ahead.
I really would. I know it's difficult when you all of a sudden should talk about a figure which lived 1,000 years ago and which is not necessarily very present in the minds of people nowadays. But I would really urge people to look into this question, because the connection between Ibn Sina and the present solution to Afghanistan, I look at it this way. If Ibn Sina would not have come up with the discovery of quarantine, yeah, maybe somebody else would have eventually done it. But historically, Ibn Sina did discover it. And, in a certain sense, since I have this idea of the dialogue of civilizations and cultures, this is not just between cultures in the present. When you study universal history, you find a very fascinating phenomena, and that is that universal ideas which are true independent where they are being produced or thought, they travel throughout the centuries. And that gives you a dialogue of civilization, which is not just in the same time space, but you can have a dialogue of cultures, of thinkers of 2,000 years ago with somebody in the present. I think I have demonstrated that to be the case between Confucius and Friedrich Schiller on the question of aesthetical education. One easily can use it prove it on musical ideas and science. Naturally, a universal discovery is true in every country. So I would think that I think the way to look at Ibn Sina and Afghanistan is, we have a pandemic. This pandemic will not go away until we have a modern health system in every country, for the very simple reason, even if the Omicron variant sort of would die down in the United States and Europe, become less dangerous, there is no guarantee at all that if we don't develop Africa or Asia or Latin America, that there will be not new mutations, which then will combine with some of the more aggressive versions like Delta and more lethal versions, and you could have a Black Death, much worse. And in any case, I'm saying that the outcome of this present fight must be a modern health system in every country. If we don't learn that lesson out of this pandemic, then we are not intelligent. And I think the human species is an intelligent species. And I think we should look at Ibn Sina's role in this, that we have we should be grateful, thankful to Ibn Sina, and prove that thankfulness by building a modern health system, first in Afghanistan, also in Haiti, Yemen, Syria, and all the other countries which are in a desperate need. And I would really urge all the people on this panel and the people who are watching it, spend some time to engage your mind in the history of Afghanistan. There are other great figures, but start with Ibn Sina, because you will only do justice to any country when you know the history, the best science, the best poetry, and not like when the Afghanistan papers were published by the Washington Post in 2019. They admitted, all these generals and so forth, they said, we don't know what we're doing here. We're like poking in the fog. We don't know who the enemy is. If you don't know who the culture is of the country in which you are making war, you cannot win. And I think war is also an obsolete means of resolving conflict, especially in the age of nuclear weapons. But I would really urge people to think about the great contribution of Ibn Sina and make that the figurehead of our effort to come to a positive resolution of this.
Yeah, Dr. Elders, I know you're going to have to get going fairly soon, but I thought that, especially given what Helga just went through it, and also we have several questions we're not going to go through, which are around what people can do. People are asking now about getting involved with the committee. People are asking about, what do they feel a certain amount of either confusion or concern about what's changing in the United States right now. The flaws in public health have now been pretty well revealed. That's one of the topics being discussed, in fact, today in various of these Martin Luther King ceremonies. So, as you prepare to leave us, if you could say a few things just about your own view of how that all should be, what people can do. You've said a couple things already, but I think it'd be good if you could elaborate.
But I think when we think about what people can do, I mean, what we're talking about is what countries can do, and what political powers can do, and there are lots of things people can do individually on their own, but for as making an impact on the world, that's unless you're a political power or somewhere where you can really make that becomes a lot more difficult. But one of the things I think the idea of we certainly could all get together and really form what we call a kind of, if you will, a medical manifesto to create what it is that what the world should be about, and what's the basic if you will, the basic public health foundation that every country could have. Maybe every country doesn't need a fleet of neurosurgeons, but every country, would need or does need a, a good public health foundation. Not every country may not need to do everything, but I think every country can do something and do the things that they can do. And use the expertise that we have from different countries and different segments of different countries. I think the idea that we can, not every country need to develop uh, immunizations for all of the different viruses that are coming up, but if different ones develop methodology and make them available to all of the other countries. So, and we can develop things that we can do and can really put together and bring together and make a difference. And and it's, I think as we heard our person in nutrition talk about, well, everybody don't need to grow winter wheat, but we can grow spring wheat. We can grow and ship different things. Yeah. And so, but we don't think about that. We all think about what we can do and what we want to do and what works well for us. And I understand that. But while we understand that, I think we need to come to, if we could really somehow come together as a major group, different people from different areas of the country, each country decide, making decisions and get involved in what we can do. Most of us aren't doing what we can. So I think with that kind of thought, it's I'm not politically savvy enough, I don't think, to know what how to do it, how to start, how to get it done. But
I'm
I
going to
think
prevail
that there
on you
are
just for
people.
another minute. Hold on, I'm just going to prevail on you
What?
for another minute. I'm going to prevail on you for another minute. Helga, I just think because of what she said about this medical manifesto, I don't know if you knew this, but Dr. Satcher and some others have been discussing this partially because of some of the changes that are being discussed right now. What do you think about that idea? Because that's kind of a subset, the doctors is one sort of grouping of people we've been talking to for a while. How do you respond to that?
Well, I
I
think
think
that's a good idea.
I
I'm
think that's
sorry.
an excellent idea, because I think we should be able, after 2 years of the pandemic, to learn the mistakes which were made, correct those mistakes, and then draw the conclusion. And I think I still think the Committee of Coincidence of Opposite is something which should spread all over the world to fight for this idea of a health system in every country. Because I think this is one of these branching points, which we absolutely have to take the right road. because the alternative would be a plunge into chaos and a dark age. So I think that, I would really like to engage in a more direct discussion about it. And I think, given the fact that we just had a very exciting call with young people from many countries, from practically all over the world, I think that if they would also start to engage in the need to have a manifesto of what does it mean to have a modern health system, and how do we go about it, we could start talking to parliamentarians, to medical associations, to doctors, to clinics, and really get this idea rolling. Because for me, to get a world health system with a real solid health system in every country, which would ideally mix Western medicine with traditional medicines in China, in India, in other countries, because many of these national medicines have very useful ideas, which would be complementary to Western medicine. So I think that we could come out of this crisis with a much more rational approach to the world. And since the modern health system is not possible without electricity, lots of electricity, lots of energy, lots of clean water. 2 billion people have right now not access to clean water, but if you want to have a modern health system, you need clean water, and that means you have to have infrastructure. So building a modern health system could be the beginning of overcoming poverty and underdevelopment for good, which I think is the disgrace in any case, that, why should the developing countries always remain in such an incredible situation where 50,000 children are dying, every day, and that is under normal conditions. I mean, that should be overcome, and I think poverty eradication would be the natural next step after building a modern health system. So what we are really talking about is creating the world as a garden in which every human being which is born can live and have a fulfilled life. I don't think that is a utopian conception. I think that this is something all people from many centuries were aspiring to have, especially the founding fathers of the United States. And people like John Quincy Adams absolutely wanted to have that for every country, working together as an alliance of republics. So let's have a debate about that, and I think that would be the best outcome of this crisis.
Okay, well, thank you. And Marcia, of course, part of this was directed toward you, so maybe you could go right ahead at this point.
Well, I just agree that, well, there's a question's been asked, what about the United States? Should they go back into Afghanistan for stability? We'll have the stability of the graveyard unless we take advantage and activate on what already is a big role of the United States. There's an American national who heads the World Food Program. By the way, I think he's from South Carolina, David Beasley, a former governor. But his guiding principle is people should not die. And that's the threat we have, the scale of the threat we have in Afghanistan, not limited to there, Haiti, places in Africa, and so on. But it has been a traditional American positive intervention that we've seen over the decades in the original best idea of the USAID, Agency for International Development, or the Food for Peace section of it, or the Alliance for Progress under Kennedy. It's not saying that these were all perfect and they later did become corrupted. But now we are called upon in this emergency, and I think the what we should do is our best to make known, break the blackout. It still isn't broken, even though there's attention to things, and I have found over the last couple years, working with the Committee for Coincidence of Opposites, that there's expressions of what we should do. There's a very outspoken colleague of ours named Dr. Khadija Lang, based in California, who's a practicing physician. and she's active in Africa. And she is the National Medical Association's chairman of the international committee of theirs. And she said, I can't treat a corpse. We have to have the food. We have to have the water. I can't treat a corpse. And there are others with specialties. I question or ask about it in agriculture, in engineering, in logistics, and including many Afghanistan nationals. And so, yes, the answer, let's be exceptional and break profile, whatever the profile may have been, and work to spread the word of what's going on and what we can do about it. And I surely think someone mentioned about the engagement of people from around the world. Take potatoes in Afghanistan. Wouldn't someone from Peru or Idaho or Maine like to be involved? The answer is yes, some of these potato growers, but they have been blocked by the neo-great games that's going on that has to stop. And I'll just conclude with one thing for people to enjoy. Just like we have new breakthroughs in vaccinations and we can have a division of labor, there was just a breakthrough announced this year that you don't have to grow potatoes by taking a piece of one that has an eye in it and putting it in the ground. China has done the genomic mapping so you can grow them now from seeds. We have no physical limitations to development, to peace, and to conquering the threats of pandemic. So that's all I have to say, and I think that's what we should do.
Okay, very good. I believe that although we have a lot of other questions, we're going to have to pretty much summarize. Is it the case, Dave, I just wanted to check with you that we have one other individual that had something to respond to? Or is that not the case? Is that Mr. Tarin, Qasim Tarin, co-founder of the Unity and Freedom Movement of Afghanistan? So what we'd like you to do is to please just go ahead and whatever you've got to say, please make it short. We're already over time and we've got to do summary remarks from the panel. We apologize for that, but that's our situation. So please go right ahead.
Thank you so much. Once again, my name is Qasim Tarin. I'm the co-founder of Unity Freedom and Movement of Afghanistan, as well as the chairman of Afghan Business Network. I am building or working based on economic development of Afghanistan through prosperity in business. So thank you so much for giving me the chance to talk with stand before you and talk about Afghanistan, the richest country in the world with the poorest people in the world. What did that mean? Afghanistan has a range of between $3 to $6 trillion estimated with minerals in that country. However, unfortunately, they got caught within this great game, which is unfairly got caught. I'd like to quick flash through the past 43 years, a very quick, lack of the time. However, when the Afghan people got together with the Western and especially United States of America to end the Cold War, by the power of those people, we ended the Cold War in the world by bringing the Geneva Conventions contract has been signed, and then the Western region, includes the United States of America, turned their back to those people who helped them to end the Cold War. And then another situation it started with the civil war in that country, and due to this situation happened because the United States and the Allies turned their back, and then the 9/11 happened, and then after 9/11, For the 20 years of the war against terror, the people of Afghanistan stand by United States and the world to fight against terror. Unfairly, again, the United States and the allies made a peace with Taliban, with the enemy, and then at the end, they allowed the Taliban to come in power again. And once that happened, right now, again, the Western region and the world unfairly turned their back to those people who help us to fight against terror. Now, what they say is this, what Dr. King was saying this, the time is always right to do what is right. This is Dr. Martin Luther King said that. And this is the time now to bring peace with the people of Afghanistan. Stop all these terror against them. Please save their life. Where are the people of the world to look back at the last 40 years and see what they've been through, the Afghan people, what they have done for the world, and finally, at the end of the day, their children are starving to death. And I will suggest to help the people, release the funds, help them through the humanity, and make them to become self-sufficient. Don't give them fish if you don't want to teach them how to fish. We need to create jobs for them. We need to help them to go through this terrible situation at this time. And I really do appreciate all the speakers who has been talking from their heart for the Afghan people. And I will say this at the end, I know the time is very limited. I like to say what Dr. King said this. We need leaders, not in love with money, but in love with justice. Not in love with publicity, but love with humanity. And I will leave you with that. And thank you so much for giving me the chance. And I will be glad to keep in touch with anyone who wants to speak with me or talk with me through this conference. Thank you so much for giving me the chance. Appreciate it.
You're very, very welcome, sir. And that was a very succinct and useful use of your time. I was just informed that there has also been an earthquake today in Afghanistan, 5.3 on the Richter scale, 26 people dead so far. So your message is more than timely. So thank you very much. What we're going to do is to begin to go to summary remarks. And I think what I'll do is I'll start with Mr. Fuller and then go to Dr. Elders, because I think she has to get going. But since I think, Mr. Fuller, this is your first time on one of these, and there may be many things that you have to you're reflecting upon. So go right ahead, and you can say your piece here.
Well, thank you. I don't want to get off into the long history that Dr. I didn't notice his name from
Baraki.
Dr. Baraki. Yeah. I have to challenge his position that this was no communist coup. Look, I'm the last person in the world to be accusing people of being communists. I think this is one of the more vicious levels of attack that has been part of American politics for a very long time for somebody you don't like or who is progressive. But in the case of Afghanistan and the coup in 1978, I don't think there was any doubt in the world that there were two communist parties in the country. I don't say that as an insult. They were known to be that. They were known. I was in close contact with the Chinese at that time, who had obviously special insight into communist movements and things like that around the world, who were fully in accordance with that interpretation. It was Afghan military officers who had studied in the Soviet Union and had come back, who pulled off this coup. There were even indications later on in American intelligence that the Soviet Union had advised against a communist coup because they thought the Communist Party was not capable of handling the country after that. And the Soviet Union was exactly right. There are any number of evidences but that's not the point. The point, Dr. Baraki is correct that when the Soviet Union did come in, there were quite a number of significant reforms, including for women, but it was a very tough regime that echoed, I think, at the very least, what Soviet Union's own style of governance was. But beyond that, I don't want to go into that any further. I'm the last person in the world to be defending either George Bush or Brzezinski or anybody else in their interpretations. My entire talk, I think, today indicated that I was very much hostile to that kind of American thinking. So please, Dr. Baraki should not try to tar me with that particular brush, and I think needs to examine a little more closely what is fairly solid consensus among scholars about the nature of the Communist Party that took over, and immediately tried to apply communist ideas, which was why the party failed miserably right away. Anyway, let's put that aside. I just want to reiterate, I think I've heard some inspiring things here today, particularly from Helga's vision on the way the world could be. I'm a skeptic as to how much the world can actually learn from these mistakes. Maybe we do from time to time, but it certainly doesn't hurt to examine the failures that we have had. And in particular, I think for the United States, it is vital for its own future and health and wealth and welfare to abandon its traditions of hegemonic policies, and I would have to say even neo-imperial policies around the world, and particularly after the fall of the Soviet Union, when the United States was then the world's sole superpower. The U.S. has never recovered from that and is still struggling, I think, to accept the fact that other nations around the world are rising in power, particularly China, and that the old American leader of the world game is over, and that the cooperation with other powers with many, many common interests is the future. It's the road to the future. There are no reasons why there cannot be win-win solutions, and simply seeking to identify who your latest challenger is, which is the way Washington works, is a recipe for disaster, and convincing other countries that indeed they are perceived as the enemy. I think it's possible, and I'm glad that this seminar is able to bring forth some calls for a greater sense of humanitarian common sense and the common good across Central Asia. Nobody benefits from war. Nobody benefits from starvation or chaos. And the quicker that this can all be put to bed in the region, benefit America, China, Russia, Iran, all of Central Asia, Pakistan, Europe, who will be spared future refugees. It's a win-win situation if we're smart enough to understand that.
Thank you, very much, Mr. Fuller. And let me just say that we hope that there'll be some opportunities to, in fact, have longer sort of subset discussions and debates about these matters. It's very important for the United States and its population. It's very important in these days of discussion that have crept in, and it's very important that people like you and others are participating. Dr. Elders, we're going to go to you next.
Let me pass.
You want to pass? Okay, very
I
good.
want to pass.
All right, Dr. Mehrabi.
Yes. Can you hear me? I lost contact for a minute, but I was able to get that back. But I think the important point, there are a number of points that I want to bring up. One is, I think it should be noted that I think this is what we are facing right now is a central issue of our time. And I think it will be very important to see how the world will address the chaotic situation that has been created, not because of the fault of the ordinary Afghans, but because of the fault of foreign forces that actually were instrumental in one way or another to bring about the situation that the country is suffering from. I also want to mention, I think, in my which I clearly articulated the position of what needs to be done overall to address the needs of the short term as well as the long term. I want to emphasize the fact that humanitarian aid, while it's necessary, it is not sufficient. I think we are going to be fooling yourself to clearly concentrate only on humanitarian aid without looking at what needs to be done or looking at solution to rescue the economy from disaster in free fall. The humanitarian aid is a short gap measure, and it will not go ahead and allow economic development that this country needs very badly. And as when you look at these piecemeal humanitarian exemptions that are also been given by the Treasury Department, whether it's Journal License 14, 15, or 16, 17, or 18, 19, it really does not address the central issue of how Afghanistan can now at least engage in import and export, and how can collect taxes and then pay for the salaries. We're talking about an economy that is in a state of collapse. And I think what needs to be done is to allow at this stage the banks to operate. The funds need to be transferred from Afghanistan, that they should not be intercepted by intermediate banks. And all those intermediary banks, they are afraid of the United States and the sanction that could be imposed upon them. And that is choking of the economy. But clearly no increase in food or medical aid can compensate for the macroeconomic harm of soaring prices, double-digit prices of basic macroeconomic, and also collapse of the banking system. It cannot compensate for the balance of payment that has been created unless the United States allow Afghan central bank to have access to the Afghan's reserve, and to be able to allow the institution to continue and not really ripping off the society of Afghanistan and the existing financial institution. And I think all of that could be done with the Treasury relaxing and providing a lot of comfort letters and making sure that they engage actively with trying to allow the commerce to flourish, and allow ordinary Afghans to be able to afford to buy the basic necessities of life: food, cooking oil, sugar, and fuel oil.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Marcia?
Yes, I'll just repeat the one thing I said before. It's in line with Dr. Mehrabi. I think there is no way that the humanitarian aid he described, food, medical care, and so forth, which, by the way, the World Food Program does the logistics for, the airplanes, the delivery trucks, the buildings, and so forth. This won't work without at the same time, having the institutions that no nation can do without be reestablished, which is the especially institution of currency and banking and credit. These are sovereign. This is the definition of a sovereign nation. And I think that the scale in which we have to ask is also calling the question of all the national economies of the world with the hyperinflationary breakdown we face. We can't muster enough food, and the big things, the electricity, water, and so forth, without restoring sovereignty everywhere else. And so I yield my time, and that's my point.
Okay, very good. Normally, I'm going to ask Diane if she has anything to say. This is the only point at which the co-moderators get the right to express any point of view. So, Diane, why don't you jump in while you have the chance?
Sure. Okay, thanks. For reasons some people know, this question of American exceptionalism is important to me. And I just would say that what was exceptional, let me put it that way, about the creation of our republic was it was explicitly against the British Empire, and we stated in our founding documents that all men are created equal and that the purpose of government is the promotion of the general welfare. I think that our action as a nation right now with regard to Afghanistan will not only demonstrate whether we can return our lost republic to its mission against imperialism and colonialism and the degradation of the human species, or whether we will fail, in which case what really is going to be lost is millions of lives, and also I don't know the consequences of the United States actually failing to return to this anti-colonial mission, because I'm afraid that we can do a great deal of damage in the world. So I think it's incumbent upon all Americans, if you think that there's something good about our republic, as I absolutely do, then we have to hold ourselves and our nation to a standard that is worthy of our intention.
All right. Now, if Dr. Elders is going to say nothing, I'm going to. Is that the case?
I'll let you.
You all right, fine. So I'm going to say something here just because it is Martin Luther King Day. His actual birthday was January 15th, but I'm doing this in reflection upon a friend of mine who passed away this past week. And this is by dint of comment on the question of American exceptionalism. His name was Bill Jenkins. Bill was a Vietnam War veteran. His father was a minister in Harlem, and Bill joined the Armed Services of the United States at the age of 19, and he became a highly specialized operative. He was very patriotic, and he wanted to serve his country. And he ended up being flown into a secret war in Laos and then in Cambodia, in which he had no dog tags, and it was a war that never existed. And when he left the service, his service was not reported. It is, he was reported he was in Germany the entire time that he was actually doing what he was doing. What he was doing was he was what is called a lethal weapon. Of course, there was a famous movie made by that term, but people don't know that these people existed. They were called the shadow people. And they were sent on missions which were illegal and they were criminal, but they were told that they were not. They were told they were essential and necessary. And he was very good at his job, as many, many others were as well. Many people died, and he did not want to be part of that, but he was part of that. It's important to talk about this because here's another way of looking at the American exception question. Because he was an exceptional person, he joined our organization. He became involved with the Schiller Institute, and he became involved. We met him back in 1981. I met him in 1981, 40 years ago. And he was proud of the idea that there was a way for him to do something now, or in that ensuing 4 decades, that actually didn't compensate or make up for what had happened, but at least allowed him to come by an actual positive conception of the United States that he thought he was serving in the first place, but was caused to engage in the kind of things that people have become well aware of, whether at Guantanamo, which is not the kind of thing he got involved in, or My Lai, which is closer to some of the kinds of things. And that can be said. I think it's important to say it. I don't think he would have a problem with me saying it. He certainly had talked about it when he needed to talk about it. But it's not the kind of thing the soldiers talk about because they're serving their nation. They're patriotic. They recognize that they have a sense of duty, but then there's a higher purpose. And that's what came into conflict for him, particularly because of his deep belief in God and because of the way in which he had been raised by his father. So the country we're in is severely conflicted. If you're talking about the United States, there are people all over the world watching this. But of course, the United States has an outsized impact on the lives of people all over the place, including in China, in Russia, where people are trying to speak with our corresponding leaders of our nations. But those of us who were associated for a long time with Lyndon LaRouche or otherwise were part of the founding of this movement know that leadership often has to volunteer itself. And it may be inadequate and it may need to be better informed. But one thing that is important, I think, in what we have been addressing all day is that the individual talent of people is very, very important. And the spending of your talent wisely, as we heard from the first speech that was given at the beginning by Lyndon LaRouche, is very important. But I wanted to just say that because otherwise that might not be, since Ray McGovern's not here and there are many things about this. Yes, there's a great revolutionary tradition of the United States. It's the only great thing, in one sense, the United States has given to the world, but it's the greatest thing you could give. Yet, that has not been characteristic of our foreign policy. It hasn't been characteristic of our domestic policy either. So I just think it's important as we think about what happened when Helga Zepp-LaRouche founded this committee, which was in May of 2020. It was actually in direct response to the murder, what is now, of course, acknowledged to be the murder of George Floyd. And there were people who were very skeptical about that, including some of her own associates, and didn't understand the connection, didn't understand what this was supposed to do, didn't understand it had this idea, this name, Committee for the Coincidence of Opposites. So why call it something so complicated? And now we see in this January how that idea has somehow become the precise idea for this time that in discussion, debate, among many of us and many other people around the world may yet prove to be the one way out of the present circumstance. So I just wanted to say that and now ask that Helga might give our final remarks for this seminar.
Yeah, I want to emphasize 3 points. One, in answer also to Dr. Baraki, that indeed, a lot of the things he said were absolutely on the mark, including Brzezinski's role, because we published this immediately when it happened in 1975, when Brzezinski, at a meeting of the Trilateral Commission in Tokyo, proposed to play the Islamic card against the Soviet Union. And a lot of what has happened ever since is the long-term result of that policy, including what happened in Benghazi in Libya. Remember then when General Flynn wanted to brief President Obama in 2012 about what he thought was the wrong policy of the United States in the Middle East. So, I mean, I'm just saying that there is a whole side of this affair which needs to be abandoned because, it's the I think it's from Wallenstein, the Piccolomini part. It is the curse of the evil deed that it continuously must give birth to more evil deeds. And you have to somehow make a break with that if you want to get to a better point. Now, the second point is that I really want to call on all of our participants in the panel, but also in the people who are listening, because we plan to have a mobilization. This is not just a one-time seminar, but we want to arouse many people to help to bring a change and help to Afghanistan. And for that purpose, we are right now in discussion with a think tank of a major other country that we want to have a new, larger conference, probably before the end of this month, where the Schiller Institute and the think tank of this other very important large country would co-sponsor such an event. I'm still not totally, it's not totally clear yet, because these people are also extremely busy because they have all kinds of other problems on their hands as well. But hopefully this will happen, and I'm asking all of you to help build attendance for this second bigger conference, because we have to get a breakthrough on this Afghanistan question. And that leads me to my third and final point. I want you to join the Schiller Institute, to join the Committee of Coincidence of Opposites, because this is the place where we can discuss together what kinds of initiatives to release the funds immediately. That's the easiest thing that could be done with a stroke of the pen. If President Biden would say, let's release it, it would be done in a second. And we have to build up a public demand that should happen. The same goes for the European banks, who also have some of these assets. But more broadly, as Marcia was saying and others, we need to have an agricultural program. The medical system has to be built. And for that, we need people to cooperate with the Schiller Institute, the Committee of Coincidence of Opposite, and especially Operation Ibn Sina. And I really want, again, to warm your heart to look into the history of this, because you will get all excited and you will recognize, that sometimes when you are in a big crisis, you have to seek out the best traditions of your history and find some new exciting ideas, which will look completely different because the time has changed. And therefore you find a lot of answers, like not only in the canon for medical science, which probably medicine has advanced a lot, but the philosophical part of Ibn Sina, the question of the necessary existent, that has some challenges, including, which will be asked with the deployment of the James Webb telescope. And I talked about that in my presentation. So these are not just some ancient philosophical question. What is this necessary existent, and how does it pertain to the development in the universe? Is the universe, did it start with a big bang? Is it there eternally? What are the principles? Anyway, these are relevant questions, and they will get your intellectual faculties all excited. And that's the best thing you can do, because if you are creative yourself and alive, then you are also the most potent person to change history. So I want to invite you to join this intellectual effort as well.
Mr. Qasim Tarin, Professor Dr. Shah Mehrabi, Marcia Mary Baker, Dr. Joycelyn Elders, Graham Fuller, Diane Sayre, and also to Ray McGovern, who's not with us now, and Professor Matin Baraki, already thought him. Thank you very much for being with us today and participating with this. I think a lot of people got a lot out of it. I think some people may be somewhat surprised that this is the way in which we chose to celebrate and commemorate Martin Luther King's birthday, but I don't think he would be. So thank you very much. And we're going to continue the work. We're going to conclude today with what we actually began with, a segment from Lyndon LaRouche, on this case, I think only the audio, and his comments about Martin Luther King and why he was so important. And we leave you with this so that perhaps you may think about doing what Dr. King did.
We have two problems, I think, which should be the basis for reflecting on Martin's life today. One, we have a national crisis. Now, I'm not going to mince words, and I'm not going to do any political hacking, but the facts have to be told. This economy is collapsing. The situation, relatively speaking, in terms of basic economic infrastructure of the United States today is worse than in 1933 when Roosevelt came into the White House in March. That is, you look around you, infrastructure, energy, so forth, the conditions of life of our people around the world. And don't look in the big cities where they put on a facade and say things are fine. Look in the communities. For example, Detroit now has half the population it used to have. An industrial city is gone. Look around Birmingham, you see how the same thing is reported. It was never rich, but their sense of loss of this, that. That's the situation of the United States. We are in trouble. And look at the world. The world faces a great crisis, and the United States faces a great crisis in dealing with the world. The largest concentrations of population of the world are China, for example, 1.3 billion or more, India over 1 billion, then you have Pakistan, Bangladesh, and the countries of Southeast Asia. This is the greatest concentration of population on this planet. It's an emerging part of the world. The question is, what's the relationship of the United States to these people of Asia who represent, by and large, different cultural backgrounds than those of us in the United States or in Western Europe? How are we going to find peace in a troubled world? How are we going to find reconciliation in a troubled world with countries which have turned against us because of the war policies of Cheney and some others? So we do not face a new problem today, in one sense. We face the same problem in principle that Martin faced, and faced successfully. And I would propose that in the lesson of Martin Luther King and his life, there is something we can learn today which brings him back to life as if he was standing here alive today. There's something special about his life, his development, which should be captured today by us, not only in addressing the problems of our nation, which are becoming terrible, but the problems of our relationship with the world as a whole. How are we going to deal with these cultures that are different than our own? With an Asian culture, with Muslim cultures around the world, over 1 billion Muslims around the world, with the culture of China, which is different than ours, the culture of Southeast Asia, which is different than ours, the cultural background. They're all human, they all have the same ultimate requirements, the same needs, but they're different cultures. They think differently. They respond to different predicates than we respond to. But we must have peaceful cooperation with these people to solve a world problem. Then you start thinking about someone like Martin. And I want to indicate in the context I just stated what the significance of Martin is today. We had no replacement for Martin. Lesson number one. Martin was a unique personality. He was not a talented person who happened to stumble into leadership and could be easily replaced by other leaders who would learn the job and take over afterward. We had no replacement. No one in the position to replace him. Many wished to be, they didn't have it. So this is the problem. We have a population, we have a world in which there's a shortage of people who actually understand fully the meaning of the difference between man and beast. That man is a creature, as defined by Genesis 1, is made in the likeness of the creator of the universe. This is us. We are, because we transmit these ideas, because we transmit this work as no animal can, we love one another. We love the people who come before us. We love those who are coming after us. We care for them in a very selfish way, because in our spending our talent of life, our sense of beauty depends upon what was coming out of our life in future generations. We love children for that reason. They're our children. We love grandchildren even more than children sometimes. Because that's our children were able to produce these children. That's great. I mean, you love them specially, and particularly a person become a grandparent. They love these grandchildren especially for that reason. So this kind of loving is lacking generally in the population, in leaders. Martin obviously had that. Martin was one of the rare people in his time who had a deep sense of what it is to be a human being, who had a deep sense of the lesson of the passion and crucifixion of Christ, and was able to bring to politics, which he didn't go in to get in as politics as such. He was a natural leader. The natural leader is one who comes not from the political process as such, but from the people. Martin never achieved political office. Yet he was probably as important a figure of the United States as any modern president. He achieved that. His authority as a leader came from the people. He fought against the people and with the people to free them.